Chapter 485, Considerate, 2, Chu Lien pouted, buried her face into the front of his robes, and said in a slightly muffled voice, "Hubby, grandmother doesn't like me anymore." Chu Lien had been using a questioning tone earlier, but now she was stating a fact. She wasn't stupid. Despite the matriarch's attempt at acting as per normal, she had still been able to sense that something was wrong. When someone truly cared for you, you would be able to sense it in their gaze, their actions, their words. It wasn't just Chu Lien who had this feeling, He Changdi felt the same. His brows wrinkled slightly and he thought of the movements in the estate for the past 2 days. Chu Lien had suffered on the trip to the north and she had even succeeded in bringing back the medicinal ingredient needed to cure his mother. Grandmother wasn't an unreasonable person, so she should be treating Chu Lien even more dearly. Why had she become cold and distant instead? There had to be some external factor influencing her. He Sanlang's pupils dilated as he sunk deep into his thoughts. When a sudden notion came to him, his eyes narrowed. After his past life, He Changdi knew how important it was to make sure that there were no conflicts between even the closest of families. Otherwise, the gaps in their hearts would give rise to internal family troubles. Grandmother was aging and his aunt was right by her side. Many things were different from his past life. He comforted his wife by stroking her back with his palm. Resolution formed a decision in his heart. "Lianer, what do you think happened?" Chu Lian's brows formed a frown. She sat up and straightened her posture before sharing her analysis. "Hubby, could it be Uncle Mo?" He Sanlang looked at her with undisguised admiration, as they had reached the same conclusion. "Don't worry about this, I'll handle it. As for grandmother, she's old and may have become muddle-headed, don't take her actions to heart. I'm the one who you're spending the rest of your life with, not her." Chu Lien knew that He Sanlang was right, but feeling alienated from the matriarch for no reason left a bad taste in her mouth. In the past, she may not have cared about this, but since she wanted to pass her days happily with He Changdi and help him manage the family, it was hard for her to stay positive. As a granddaughter-in-law, she didn't want to be disliked by her grandmother-in-law. Chu Lien puffed up her cheeks and said, "But I'm still unhappy." He Changdi understood his wife's train of thought. It was precisely because she cared about him that she wanted the approval of all of his relatives, and to be on equal footing with him. The caring consideration from his wife warmed He Sanlang's heart. Her cute and chubby puffed-up cheeks gave him a sudden urge. He let out a low chuckle and pulled her closer. With just a simple tilt of his head, his lips were already covering her pout. He tasted her smooth and sweet lips before pushing past them and plundering her mouth. When Chu Lien ran out of air, she pushed at his chest and he finally released her. "Do you still have the strength to get angry now?" Chu Lien's lips had turned red from his bullying. She glared at him with her clear eyes. "He Changdi, you're getting more and more out of hand." He Sanlang's icy face broke into a smile that resembled a warm breeze. Although Chu Lien was still displeased with him, she couldn't bear to spoil this relaxed expression of his. Now that she had become estranged from the matriarch, albeit through no fault of her own, he was the one stuck in the middle. Things would be tough for him in the future. Chu Lien's heart ached for her grim-faced husband. She stroked He Sanlang's cheek and said softly, "Forget about it. I'm not made of gold, so I can't be liked by everyone. I can't control how grandmother thinks, but it'll be fine as long as my conscience is clear. You don't have to think too much about this, we're not living our lives for others to see." He Sanlang hadn't expected Chu Lien to be able to let the matter go. His heart was instantly enveloped in warmth that he had never felt before. Chapter 486, Roast Duck, 1. It was hard to hold back his emotions, so he was about to catch Chu Lien for a round of intimate snuggling when she abruptly rejected him. Chu Lien's fair hands covered his thin lips. "You can't. I have to meet Princess Wei in a short moment." He Changdi did his best to restrain himself and simply groped her chest a little. He whispered something softly into her ear. Whatever he said made Chu Lian flush bright red. She pressed her lips together, struggling to find a response. He Changdi watched her with his black pupils as his hand started misbehaving again. Chu Lian knew that he had a domineering personality, so she quickly pleaded for mercy and agreed to his request. He Sanlang finally broke out into a smile. If only it was already night time. Chu Lian's reaction to his words was a harsh pinch to his arm. Unfortunately, He Changdi's biceps were rather tough, so it was Chu Lian's fingers that hurt instead. After a few minutes, Chu Lian asked, "What happened to your aunt?" She had been curious about eldest madam's past since yesterday. However, He Sanlang had turned into a pervert the moment he had returned, so she hadn't been able to find a chance to ask. Luckily, they had some time now. The only ones who knew about matters in the estate from 2 decades ago were the matriarch's old servants. They were also likely to be the matriarch's closest aides, so she couldn't just ask them about it. The original novel hadn't mentioned anything about He Ying and her daughter either, so if she wanted to know more, the quickest way would be to ask He Changdi. He had plenty of useful subordinates around. He could even ask his mother, Countess Jinggan, so he probably knew most of it. He Sanlang poked Chu Lian's forehead with a finger. "You're only thinking to ask your husband now. I thought you weren't interested in that matter anymore." The trust and reliance his wife had for him had satisfied He Sanlang's male ego. A soothing warmth suffused his heart. Chu Lian glared at him. She had been wanting to ask for a while, but this great pervert hadn't given her the chance. When He Changdi had been born, eldest Madam He Ying had already married off to Xiyang, so he didn't have any impression of this aunt of his. It was Countess Jinggan who actually had more of an impression of He Ying in the past. The majority of what He Sanlang knew of his aunt had come from his mother. He Ying was matriarch He's only daughter and the eldest miss of the He estate back then. When Count Jinggan and He Ying had still been young, matriarch He had followed the old count to the battlefields. The foundations of the He family hadn't been very stable back then and they had a pitiful number of family members. Count Jinggan, He Yanwen, was 7 years older than this little sister, He Ying. When the old count had gone to battle, He Yanwen had been old enough to follow his parents in the army. However, He Ying had only been 2 or 3 then, so matriarch He had no choice but to leave He Ying behind in the care of her mother-in-law. She also left some trusted maidservants in the old He residence to watch over her daughter. The couple had then taken their son with them to the army, leaving only He Ying and her grandmother behind in the family residence. Matriarch He's mother-in-law was already old then and she spoiled her granddaughter. She had been the one to raise He Ying alone until she turned 7. In all that time, matriarch He and the old count had only returned 3 times. It wasn't until the old count had made a significant achievement and gotten his noble title that the He family finally established their foothold in the capital. The couple was finally able to take their young daughter back to live with them. Unfortunately, the young He Ying had already been groomed into a pampered and unruly brat by her grandmother. Following that, when the He family finally settled down in the capital and matriarch He wanted to correct He Ying's upbringing, she had her mother-in-law obstructing her on one hand, while He Ying's personality had already been formed on the other. She wasn't able to achieve her goal. Later on, although her mother-in-law had already passed away, He Ying had already grown into a young lady. Matriarch He knew that her daughter was too obstinate to change, so she tried her best to restrain her daughter so that she wouldn't cause any trouble. When it finally came to He Ying's coming of age, matriarch He looked all over the capital for a good husband for her. However, on the day before her coming of age, thanks to her abrupt fever, the doctor actually found out that He Ying was pregnant. Matriarch He fainted from anger on the spot. After some investigation, they found out that the child in her belly belonged to a handsome young manservant in their estate. Matriarch He almost fainted once again. She had finally found a good husband for He Ying. yet their unmarried young miss had actually gotten pregnant. How could she marry her to a good noble family then? Thus, all she could do was to cancel the engagement. In order to conceal the whole matter, she and senior servant Luke personally forced the abortion medicine into her very own daughter. The manservant that had gotten the young miss pregnant was beaten to death. To keep this scandal from affecting the standing of their family, matriarch He and the old count hardened their hearts and married Heing off to faraway Siyang. In contrast to He Changda's calm narration of the events, Chu Lian's eyes were wide with shock. The corners of her mouth twitched. She really wanted to say that eldest madam was too stupid, but she kept it to herself considering Heing was still He Changda's aunt. However, He Sanlang seemed to know what she was thinking anyway. He snorted, "Lianer, you don't have to keep your thoughts to yourself. Aunt is an idiot to me." Although her lover was a childhood sweetheart of hers, it was absolutely shameless of her to have done something like this as a legitimate miss of a noble house. From the way Heing had acted in the past few days, they could tell that she had been spoiled rotten by the old count's mother. Furthermore, no matter how much the matriarch had tried to hide it, the circumstances made it nearly impossible. A legitimate young miss sent off to a small city far away in Siyang to marry, especially in such a rushed manner, as well as her usual unruly reputation amongst the noble circles, would set tongues wagging. Anyone with half a mind would be able to guess at what had happened. No wonder she had been excluded from society even after returning as a widow after so many years. Chapter 487, Roast Duck, 2. The matriarch was also most likely facing a ton of guilt over all of this. She probably blamed herself for not teaching Heing better in her younger years and causing Heing to become such a dislikable character. This was also probably why the matriarch was so patient and accommodating to Heing, especially in her old age. Chu Lian's eyes narrowed into slits. The apple didn't fall too far from the tree. Growing up under a mother like that, it was likely that Pan Nianzhen's personality would be similar. Time flew by as the couple were immersed in their chat. Before they knew it, the carriage had already slowed down and come to a stop. Someone announced from the outside, "Third young master, third young madam, we've arrived at Prince Wei's estate." He Changdi lifted his wife off his lap and sat her down gently to one side. He straightened out the crooked phoenix hairpin in her hair before helping her off the carriage. Royal Princess Duanjia's handmaid, Jinxiu, was already waiting at the entrance of Prince Wei's estate. When she noticed that Chu Lian had alighted from the carriage, she quickly brought a group of maidservants over in welcome. "This servant greets Marquis An Yuan and honored Lady Jeannie," Jinxiu said with a bright smile. Chu Lian quickly helped her up from her bowed position. "Are Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia in the estate today?" Jinxiu came over to support Chu Lian as she walked and led her towards the estate as she explained, "Honored lady, our royal princess has been waiting for you for the longest time. Princess Wei also missed you very much. When royal princess heard that you would be coming today, she woke up early this morning." He Changdi was following behind Chu Lian with a cold expression. Seeing how his wife had been taken away by a servant, his heart felt a little sour. Also, what had that lowly servant addressed his wife with just now? "Honored Lady Jeannie. Shouldn't she be called Marchioness An Yuan now?" The expression on tall and slender He Sanlang turned overcast. He kept his cool as he followed his wife into Prince Wei's estate. Right as they passed the screen wall of the main gates, they met a young man. He Sanlang gave pause as he watched Chu Lian bob in greeting towards the man. The young man had handsome features and a slender body. He was dressed in a long sapphire robe with a fierce mountain tiger embroidered on it. He Changdi had a good guess as to who this man was. He strode over to his wife's side and bowed precisely towards the young man. "Royal Prince." The youngest son of Prince Wei's estate, Lu Tai, raised an eyebrow in surprise before returning the bow. "I didn't know that Marquis An Yuan came visiting as well." Since this prince has nothing at hand, would Marquis An Yuan have some time for a short discussion on tactics? He Chengdi had already agreed the moment his eyes had met with Lu Tai's gaze. There were two royal princes in Prince Wei's estate. The older one, Lu Kang, had already taken a wife at the start of year and had taken up an official position in another province. He would only return home for the new year. There was only the younger royal prince left in the estate and he had not come of age yet. It was rare for Chu Lian to meet the younger royal prince, Lu Kang, when she came to visit Prince Wei's estate, so this was an interesting coincidence. He Chengdi glanced at his wife before following the royal prince to the main study in the outer court. Chu Lian followed Jinshu into the inner court to meet Royal Princess Duanjia and Princess Wei. She was helped onto a sedan and brought into Princess Wei's courtyard within 15 minutes. Once the sedan came to a halt, the curtain flap was immediately lifted forcefully from outside. Following after was a loud complaint, "Chu Lu. Were you having too much fun up in the north? Why did you take so long to come back?" Chu Lian felt speechless upon seeing that Royal Princess Duanjia had already stuffed most of her head into the sedan to glare at her. She quickly alighted from the sedan and smiled as she blinked innocently. "Good day to Royal Princess Duanjia." Royal Princess Duanjia quickly helped her up from her bow and rolled her eyes. "Good? What's good about these days? I've been dying of boredom in my estate while you were out living free and happy as a lark." Chu Lian's smile grew even wider. If living in the north could be termed free and happy, then there wouldn't be so few people living there. Royal Princess Duanjia tugged at her arm. "Hurry up, let's go in, mother's waiting for you." The two of them walked into the courtyard with linked arms as they chatted. "Chu Lu, did you bring any presents? If you didn't, I won't forgive you." Chu Lian chuckled. "Would you like some pearls? Agate? Or maybe some rubies and sapphires?" Royal Princess Duanjia turned her head away haughtily, acting like she couldn't be bothered with Chu Lian. Chu Lian covered her mouth to hide her grin. She turned her wide and innocent gaze on Royal Princess Duanjia. All right. I know Royal Princess loves to eat the most. I brought some new foods for you to try. We can eat them together with Princess Wei later." Chu Lian's words made Royal Princess Duanjia cheer right up. The edges of her mouth were curved upwards. "Really? Tell me what it's made of." Chu Lian's lips were pressed together into a smile. "It's a secret." "Very well, Chu Lu. We haven't seen each other for a few months and you've already turned bad. Don't forget that you still owe me a roast duck." Chu Lian resisted the urge to sweat. How much did Duanjia love eating roast duck? It had already been a few months and she still remembered that promise. "Well, since I'm free today, why don't we make it today? Otherwise, you'll keep thinking of it night and day." "Really?" Royal Princess Duanjia's eyes were sparkling now. Chu Lian found her reaction a little overboard. "Royal Princess, do you like eating roast duck that much?" Upon getting questioned by Chu Lian, Royal Princess Duanjia abruptly sunk into silence and the smile that had been on her face slowly disappeared. "I'm not the one who likes roast duck, it's my father." Chu Lian was stunned speechless. "Prince Wei." Royal Princess Duanjia sighed. "Actually it was grandfather who loved eating roast duck. It's almost the anniversary of grandfather's death in a few more days, so father hasn't been in a very good mood." Chu Lian really hadn't seen this coming. Who could have thought that a simple roast duck would somehow involve the previous emperor? Chapter 488, Fox Fur Capes. 1. Chu Lian patted Royal Princess Duanjia's tiny little hand. "Don't worry, I'll teach you how to cook roast duck today. Once you know how to, you can make it more often for your father." Royal Princess Duanjia felt a little better from Chu Lian's assurance. Chatting as they walked, they quickly reached the parlor of Princess Wei's courtyard. Princess Wei was wearing an elegant silver and red court dress. She was sitting on the warm hearth bed with a gentle expression as she watched Royal Princess Duanjia and Chu Lian enter. The two young ladies bobbed in greeting to Princess Wei together. Senior servant Lan quickly stepped forward to help the young ladies up. She smiled as she said, "The princess has been waiting for honored lady to return for some time." Princess Wei waved Chu Lian over. Come over here quick. Let me take a good look at you." When Chu Lian moved closer, her hands were clasped by Princess Weiss. The princess looked at Chu Lian with a motherly and loving gaze. She inspected her for a bit before exclaiming, "You've lost weight. You're much thinner than you were last winter. We'll have to get the imperial physician in to check your pulse later." Chu Lian quickly shook her head. "Princess, there's no need for that. The doctor in our estate has already done an examination and given me a clean bill of health." Princess Wei put on a stern face and disagreed. "Li Yu has already spoken with me. You were injured in the north. Although you had some treatment and the doctor said that the wound has already healed, you can't guarantee that it has healed all the way. Let's have the imperial physician look at you anyway, so that this princess can rest easy." Chu Lian's heart felt warmed by the prince's obvious affection for her. She smiled and agreed to it. "Then I'll have to trouble Princess." Royal Princess Duanjia pouted. "Chu Lu, see, with you around, mother forgets that I even exist." Princess Wei glared at her daughter helplessly. She caught sight of the dress Chu Lian was wearing today and her expression softened even more. "Ah, so the dress fits you perfectly. Duanjia has the exact same measurements." Senior servant Lan was similarly happy and spoke up in teasing, "If it isn't so. Honored lady looks beautiful in this dress." Honored lady and royal princess look like sisters standing together in these matching outfits. Since both her mother and senior servant Lan had already said so, Royal Princess Duanjia scooted over to Chu Lian's side and compared their outfits. Even she was surprised as she exclaimed, "That's true. Chu Lu, you're as tall as me now." Chu Lian was also mystified by their strong resemblance to each other. If she took a closer look, not only were their figures about the same, even their facial features seemed to be similar. Royal Princess Duanjia became even more interested in their appearances now. She held Princess Weiss' arm and swung it as she tried to plead coquettishly, "Mother, didn't you have 2 brocade dresses made for me recently? Why don't we change into them for you to see?" Princess Weiss' eyes lit up at the idea and she quickly nodded in approval. Thus, Royal Princess Duanjia pulled Chu Lian away to her room to change into the new outfits. When the two ladies finally returned to the parlor, even senior servant Lan was stunned still. The young ladies were now wearing 2 dresses of the same style, one red and one blue. Their hair was put up in the same hairstyles and they had the exact same items all the way down to their accessories. When they held hands and stood before Princess Wei, they looked like real sisters. The impact they gave the onlookers was even greater than before. Chu Lian felt a little awkward. She had the strange feeling that Princess Wei's gaze was rather heavy with emotion when looking at her, as if she were not merely her daughter's friend. Senior servant Lan's eyes misted over with unshed tears. Royal Princess Duanjia tugged Chu Lian into spinning around on the spot to show off their dresses before she beamed at Princess Wei and asked, "Mother, do we look pretty?" Princess Wei gripped the handkerchief in her hands tightly, restraining the dam of emotions about to break within her. She nodded hurriedly, "Yes, of course." Royal Princess Duanjia walked up to Princess Wei, hand in hand with Chu Lian. She turned to Chu Lian with a mischievous air, "See, Chu Lu, I told you that these dresses are pretty." She glanced over Chu Lian from head to toe before wrinkling her nose in dissatisfaction, "You're so beautiful. You're wasted on that brat He Sanlang." When Princess Wei noticed that her daughter's mouth was running out of control again, she quickly reached out and tugged at her arm, "Duanjia. What are you saying? He Sanlang has been personally named Marquis on Yuan by the Emperor." Royal Princess Duanjia rolled her eyes. So what if he's a marquis now? He wasn't able to protect Chu Lu anyway. She got injured out there in the north and she suffered so much. Princess Wei did agree on that point. She thought privately that He Changdi hadn't taken good care of Chu Lian. The bodyguard siblings, Li Xing and Li Yu, had served Chu Lian throughout the whole journey to the north, so Princess Wei knew all the details of what had happened there. It was at this time that Chu Lian spoke up. Husband came to the estate today and he was invited to the study by Royal Prince. When she heard Chu Lian's words, Royal Princess Duanjia looked like she was gloating in someone's misfortune. Chu Lu, did you say that my second brother invited He Sanlang to the study? Chu Lian nodded, not quite understanding why Royal Princess Duanjia looked so excited. Haha. That He Sanlang deserves it. Second brother loves to play pranks on others. Ah. Lu Tai liked to play pranks. What a strange pair of siblings. Chu Lian was at a loss for words and she started to worry a little for He Changdi. Her lunatic husband wouldn't so silly as to fall for someone else's prank, would he? Chapter 489, Fox Fur Capes, 2. Once Royal Princess Duanjia finished speaking, Princess Wei shot her a glare and took Chu Lian's hand to reassure her. Don't worry, although Tai is a little mischievous, he's not malicious. Marquis An Yuan will be fine. Although that was what Princess Wei was saying, she hoped inwardly that her youngest son could teach He Sanlang a lesson and make him understand his role. Even though Chu Lian's maiden family couldn't be counted on, she still had Princess Wei to stand up for her. The topic was glossed over just like that. Royal Princess Duanjia was all smiles as she sidled up to Chu Lian. Chu Lu, didn't you say you brought something new to eat? Why haven't you taken it out yet? Chu Lian's lips unconsciously lifted into a smile and she instructed Xian and Wenlan to bring the food in. A cloth-wrapped package and a food container were soon placed on the table. Chu Lian opened the package personally and took out 2 bright red capes. Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia had discerning eyes and were able to tell that the capes Chu Lian were holding were made of top-quality red fox fur. Royal Princess Duanjia was startled by the sight. Chu Lu, where did you get these? The 2 capes had slightly different designs and Chu Lian gave one to each princess. I brought these back from the north. I was lucky enough to happen upon these fox pelts, so I had them made into capes for your highness and Princess Duanjia. Red fox pelts were even more rare than white fox pelts in the Great Wu dynasty. The 2 capes that Chu Lian had brought were sleek and practically perfect, making them almost priceless. Royal Princess Duanjia immediately draped it over her shoulders and twirled around to show it off. Mother, look. Isn't this pretty? Princess Wei glared at her before scolding Chu Lian. These furs are too valuable. I'll accept them this time, but you're not allowed to spend so much on gifts in the future. Chu Lian froze up a little and her face took on a tinge of embarrassment. Your Highness, I actually didn't spend that much. The way she spoke piqued their curiosity. How much is not that much? Royal Princess Duanjia asked to satisfy the itch in her heart. Chu Lian displayed one slender finger in response. Royal Princess Duanjia guessed, a 10,000 tael note. The corners of Chu Lian's mouth twitched and she coughed before shaking her head. 10,000 taels. She didn't even have 5,000 taels on her while in the north. Royal Princess Duanjia covered her mouth in shock. Don't tell me it was 100,000 taels. Not at all, Chu Lian replied awkwardly. Princess Wei was also looking on curiously. Finally, she sent a glare to her daughter first before stating, it can't be 100,000 taels, even our estate doesn't hold that much in taels. I'm afraid genie must mean 1,000 taels. What? 1,000 taels? Isn't that a steal? After they finished their desserts, the imperial physician that Princess Wei had called for arrived. She had sent for an imperial physician skilled in treating external wounds. Once Dr. Min had taken Chu Lian's pulse and declared her to be completely healthy, Princess Wei was finally able to relax and set aside her worries. The moment Dr. Min left, Royal Princess Duanjia pulled Chu Lian off to cook roast duck. Princess Wei had no choice but to let them go, with one last glare at Royal Princess Duanjia. TL note: Madiao is a gambling card game that was popular during the Qing dynasty. There's a Wikipedia article on it, https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/Madiao. The author also left a note about the gooseberries, stating that she borrowed the name of a real-life fruit, but otherwise invented its medicinal properties for the sake of the story. Slightly smiling face. This is what the real Cape gooseberries look like. Gooseberry. I've seen these on cakes and I actually thought they were fake before. Never tried eating one though, so I don't know what they taste like. XD gooseberries as a cake topping. Chapter 490, For Beauties, 1. While Chu Lian was worrying over He Sanlang, the man in question was currently seated opposite the young Prince Lu Tai with a cool expression. There were already 3 pieces of men's accessories laid out on the table to his side. Lu Tai stared at the Go board with agitation. He was already regretting the move he had just made. Wasn't he leaping right into He Changde's trap? Why didn't he notice it earlier? However, he couldn't withdraw the move due to his pride. While Lu Tai was getting frustrated with himself, He Changde's long fingers reached into the bowl beside him and picked up a ghost stone made of black jade. With a clack, he set it down on the board and sealed the fate of the white stones. He Changde glanced at the rigid young prince. When he noticed that the young prince didn't have any more accessories left on him to bet, he generously said, "Thank you for going easy on me, Prince. Let's forget about this round." This young royal prince of Prince Wei's estate was also a famed and talented person. Although he was a legitimate son, he wasn't the heir apparent. The estate would be succeeded by his elder brother in the future. However, he had already been bestowed a separate princehood by the emperor, showing that he was more favored by the emperor in the imperial court than his elder brother. Unfortunately, Prince Lu Tai had the strange habit of bullying those who played Go with him. Although he had a rather mischievous personality, he respected those who were skillful at Go. A game of Go was the best way to befriend him. He Sanlang had never thought of befriending Lu Tai, but since Lu Tai had come knocking, he wouldn't let this opportunity go. Lu Tai stared deeply at the pieces lined up on the board with incredibly bright eyes. He would never have thought that this newly promoted Marquis An Yuan was so skillful at Go. It had been a long time since he had suffered such a crushing defeat. "Brother He, let's start another round." While speaking, Lu Tai was already placing the black and white stones back into their respective bowls. His friendly actions were a complete opposite to his haughty teasing a while ago. His way of addressing He Changde had also changed from the distant Marquis An Yuan to the more affectionate brother He. He Changde was stunned for a moment, and the edges of his mouth twitched. Actually, He Changde hadn't attained outstanding skills in Go from training hard. The fact of the matter was that Lu Tai was a terrible Go player, while He Changde was only a tiny bit above average in Go. When Lu Tai played Go with others, they didn't dare to win due to Lu Tai's status, so they racked their brains trying to give way to him. He Sanlang had won 4 consecutive rounds, but he had only used an average level of skill. It was the young prince's own fault for taking a fancy to the green jade ring on He Changde's thumb and demanding it as a bet. He had gone through great pains to receive a present from his dearest wife and it was a precious treasure to him. How could he possibly lose it to someone else? Thus, he had gone all out when playing. He Sanlang stood up and bowed towards the young prince. "Prince, I have to go to the left military guards to settle some urgent matters, but I can visit again another time to play Go with you." Since He Changde had spoken so politely, Lu Tai couldn't possibly decline. In a spontaneous decision that was out of character for him, he decided to follow He Changde to the left military guards. There were many steps to preparing roast duck. As it was only 2 hours to midday, they would only be able to eat roast duck at dinner. Chu Lian and Princess Duanjia changed into more lightweight casual dresses. They each brought a handmaid along to Princess Wei's kitchen to start cooking. There were also 2 skillful lady chefs assisting them. There were many different styles of roast duck. Chu Lian had traveled to many cities back in the modern world, and she had tried their local styles of roast duck, which all had their own special flavors. Her favorites were the Nanjing duck and Peking duck. As she hailed from Nanjing, what she first learned was of course the Nanjing style. The origins of the Nanjing duck could be traced back to the era of the Ming dynasty's first emperor, the Hongwu Emperor. The most common ways of cooking it were by grilling or with a stone oven. Chu Lian was more practiced at cooking roast duck with a stone oven, so she was going to teach Princess Duanjia this method. There were many steps they had to prepare before roasting the duck in a charcoal oven. While the steps were pretty complicated, with 2 chefs aiding them, things were a lot easier for Chu Lian and Princess Duanjia. The usually haughty Princess Duanjia was now learning conscientiously. She pressed her lips together and tried her best to memorize every single step. She also asked Chu Lian from time to time if she was doing it right. When Princess Duanjia asked about the oil coating step for the 3rd time, Chu Lian looked at her with a puzzled expression. The recipe for roast duck is quite complicated and I only managed to memorize it after doing it many times. Since it's your first time, it's normal to forget the steps or make some mistakes. You just need to practice it a few more times, Princess. If you're worried that you can't remember the recipe, I can write it down later when we're finished. Princess Duanjia's features froze in shock for a moment before blooming into a genuine and beautiful smile. She grabbed Chu Lian's arm and shook it from side to side. Chu Lu, are you serious? You're really giving me the recipe? Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. Since she was already teaching her exactly how to roast the duck, the recipe was simply trivial in comparison. Of course. There are so many steps, how could you remember it all in one try, Princess? Princess Duanjia hugged Chu Lian's arm, her eyes suddenly a little misty. Chu Lu, you're the best. Although Princess Duanjia had been born into a sheltered life, as the only daughter of Prince Wei, her life was actually extremely lonely due to Prince Wei's high status. The other noble ladies in the capital only befriended her because of her status, and none of them actually wanted to be true friends. Chu Lian was the first friend that she had ever opened her heart to. The lady in question pursed her lips and smiled, shining like a bright jewel. Princess, you've only realized how good I am now. TL note, I'm not an expert on the various styles of roast duck, so I googled the differences between Peking and Nanjing ducks. Personally, I love the crispy roasted Peking duck skin more, the way the fats just ooze into your mouth after you bite into the super crispy skin. Nanjing salted roast duck, Peking crispy roast duck. Chapter 491, For Beauties, 2, Princess Duanjia glared at her and raised a little clenched fist. She threatened, Chu Lu, you're really stupid. You have no idea what giving away this roast duck recipe means. You're just lucky that it's me you're dealing with. If you gave it to someone else, you'd definitely regret it. Still feeling uneasy, Princess Duanjia added, Chu Lu, listen to me. Don't give away your secret recipes to others so casually. Chu Lian found it funny, but she could only agree and nod. These recipes might be precious and priceless in the eyes of others, but to her, their only value was to cook up a delicious meal. If she wanted more recipes, she had plenty in her mind. After seeing Chu Lian's nod, Princess Duanjia finally relaxed a little. Princess Duanjia gave a weird sigh and said, this princess is now a little worried for Marquis An Yuan. Since he married such a silly wife, he'll have to watch you closely in the future. The side of Chu Lian's lips twitched. I thought you didn't like my husband, Princess. Princess Duanjia burst into giggles. That was in the past. That was when I thought he was a useless person. I didn't expect him to become a marquis from a single trip to the northern border. Although you're already a 5th-ranked noble wife, the title of Marchioness on UN is way more valuable than honored Lady Jeannie. Your viewpoint switches really quickly, Princess. Chu Lien teased. Princess Duanjia was feeling a little guilty inside. The reason she was flattering He Changdi now wasn't just because of his accomplishments, most of it had to do with his elder brother He Erlang. The perceptive Chu Lien noticed the odd expression on Princess Duanjia and asked, "What's wrong? Is the smoke in the kitchen making you unwell?" Princess Duanjia quickly waved her hand to deny that notion. It was already past lunchtime when they finished the basic preparations for the duck. All that was left was to hang it in the oven above charcoal-fueled flames and to turn it several times. Once it was out of the oven, they just had to brush it with a specially made oil. These could all be done by the 2 lady chefs, so Chu Lien didn't need to continue supervising them anymore. The guards of the front courtyard informed them that He Changdi had gone to the left military guards, so Chu Lien had her lunch in Princess Weiss courtyard. When it was evening time, the roast ducks were taken out of the oven. Chu Lien personally brushed a layer of fragrant oil on the duck. By doing this, she could make the duck's skin shinier and counteract the overly intense smoky flavor, making the duck's taste stand out instead. The whole kitchen was enveloped in the alluring aroma of duck fresh out of the oven. It was getting dark, so Chu Lien wanted to return home, but she was kept there by Princess Wei. "Jeannie, let's have dinner together. My husband will be back in a while. You've been here so many times, but you've never gotten to meet him." Princess Duanjia also chimed in. "Chu Lu, aren't you hungry? We haven't even enjoyed the roast ducks we spent most of the day cooking." Chu Lien couldn't put a downer on Princess Duanjia's enthusiasm, so she decided to return after having dinner in Prince Wei's estate instead. Who could have known that, when night fell, Prince Wei would return with a few familiar-looking young men. The Great Wu dynasty was more open-minded. When there were senior family members present, young men and women could speak freely with each other. More progressive families even allowed men and women to sit at the same table, but it was still a rare sight in the noble circles. A maidservant came from outside to announce that the prince had returned. Princess Wei led Princess Duanjia and Chu Lien over to the parlor to await his arrival. They waited for less than 10 minutes before they could hear the sounds of servants greeting the prince. Chu Lien and the others seated in the parlor suddenly frowned in uncoordinated unison. When the curtains of the parlor were pulled to the side by 2 maidservants, a middle-aged man walked in with a majestic air. He was tall, and despite the marks left on his face by the vestiges of time, he still possessed an amazing presence. When Prince Wei saw Princess Wei, it was as if a strong breeze lifted a veil on his face and his stern expression instantly turned gentle. There were 4 young men who entered following Prince Wei. The most well-built figure amongst them belonged to He Changjue, He Sanlang's second brother. He was wearing his Dragon Guard uniform, which was a white martial arts robe with black embroidery. His sword hung at his waist. His chiseled jaw, wide shoulders, slim waist, and tanned skin gave off a manly aura. Despite his burly looks, he had a very cheerful vibe, unlike the 2 men right behind him, who were about to form a blizzard from their iciness. He Changdi cut a striking figure in all black. His handsome face was kept stiff and cool, while his eyes were like deep pits of darkness. When he stood next to Xiao Bojian, it almost seemed like there was a repelling field between the 2 of them. He was taller than Xiao Bojian and had a more chilly countenance. He Changdi gave off the feeling of a beautiful flower on a tall cliff, refined but unattainable. Xiao Bojian was dressed in a purple robe and a large cloak in a complementary darker shade of purple. He had a slim figure which made him look like a typical court official. However, his features seemed to be crafted by the gods themselves. He was so beautiful to the point that people could forget to breathe while looking at him. With a slightly sullen expression in his eyes, it gave others the urge to coddle him more. The last man entering was the young royal Prince Lu Tai, in his royal blue robe and white jade crown. As he hadn't come of age yet, only half of his hair was bunned up, while the other half hung freely. The baby fat that he had yet to shed gave him the handsome charm of youth. Lu Tai's mouth was slightly upturned. His eyes were narrowed so that it was impossible to tell if he was smiling. On such a cold day, he was still holding a sandalwood fan and swaying it slightly, seemingly unafraid of catching a cold. The looks of the four men were all impressive in their own ways and practically embodied the different tastes of all the noble ladies in the capital. However, if they judged them according to the aesthetic sense of the Great Wu dynasty, the winner would definitely be Xiao Bojian. Although Yuehong restaurant had roast duck too, he felt that something that Chu Lian had made personally would probably be better. He Erlang was a simple man who had never been very interested in good food, but upon hearing that Royal Princess Duanjia had done half the work for the dish, he was starting to look forward to it as well. Sanlang's face turned black. He obviously wasn't happy about this. If his wife cooked for Prince Wei and Princess Wei alone, then she was simply showing filial piety to her elders and it was part of her obligations. After all, Princess Wei had showed care and concern for his wife. However, the fact that the dish that his wife had personally cooked was going to be shared with Royal Prince Lu Tai, and above all, that damned Xiao Bojian, made him extremely unhappy. The jealousy in He Changda's heart was hitting its peak. He wanted to cast Xiao Bojian out from the estate on the spot. The gloominess on Xiao Bojian's fine features faded a little upon hearing this. He sent a tender look at Chu Lian. There were many layers of unsaid emotions in that one stifling look. How wonderful, he thought. He had never expected to have another opportunity to taste Lianer's cooking again. With such sweet thoughts occupying Xiao Bojian's mind, he completely ignored He Changda's ice-cold glare. Chapter 493, Eating Roast Duck, 2. Chu Lian was feeling exceedingly awkward. That Xiao Bojian had to be absolutely mental. She had already made it so obvious that she disliked him, yet he pretended not to notice a thing. Seeing her, he looked like a fly that had just found food. She truly couldn't help but suspect that there was something wrong with Xiao Bojian's mind. Seemingly oblivious to the drama happening under his nose, Prince Wei ordered for the food to be brought in. He took delight in announcing, "Today, this prince shall have a proper taste of Genie and Duanjia's cooking." The servants of the estate moved very quickly and the dining tables were prepared in a few short moments. There were 2 tables set out. One was occupied by Prince Wei and the young men, while Princess Wei sat at the head of the other with Chu Lian and Royal Princess Duanjia. There weren't any screens placed between the men and women to obscure their view of each other. This was already common practice in the capital and there was nothing inappropriate about it. The servants soon carried in plate after plate and carefully placed them on the table. The plates in the center of the 2 round tables were the first to catch everyone's attention. A single roast duck with glistening, crispy skin was displayed on each table. While the roast ducks were exactly the same, they had been split into 2 plates with 2 completely different ways of eating it. On the first plate, the duck had been cut up into convenient bite-sized pieces and submerged in a special gravy. Meanwhile, the duck on the second plate had been cut into small slices and deboned, with thin wheat flour pancakes and various vegetables to go along with it. There were also several small dishes with different dipping sauces. The latter was the renowned Peking duck. Even the experienced and knowledgeable Prince Wei had his eyes wide open in astonishment. After looking at the fragrant roast ducks, he turned to Chu Lian who was at the other table and asked, "Genie, could you introduce these roast ducks to us?" As Prince Wei had called her out by name, Chu Lian quickly stood up and patiently explained how the dishes had been cooked, as well as how the Peking duck was to be eaten. After Chu Lian's explanation, Prince Wei waved his hand and everyone immediately rushed for the food. Lu Tai had been starving for a while now and he was practically drooling from the aroma of the roast duck. The moment his father had given permission, his chopsticks were already hastily reaching into a plate of roast duck. There was only one roast duck for each table, with the two halves separated into two different eating styles. Although roast ducks were delicious, it was too rich to eat all by itself. Thus, there were more than 10 other dishes on the tables. These other dishes were the handiwork of the chefs from Prince Wei's estate. The moment a slice of the roast duck entered his mouth, Royal Prince Lu Tai revealed an expression of utter bliss. The duck was crispy, fragrant, and fatty without being too greasy. The meat wasn't dry or hard, and was incredibly soft and tender. The most delicious part of it all was the smoky and crispy duck skin. Once he was done with his first piece of duck, Lu Tai's gaze fell upon the plate in the middle and widened in absolute shock. What the hell happened? The plate was obviously full just a moment ago, but why was there only half of it left in the blink of an eye? While he was dumbstruck, Prince Wei had already picked up another piece and stuffed it into his mouth at a ridiculous speed. Lu Tai wailed in his heart for the lost piece of duck. He reacted quickly and reached his chopsticks out for the largest piece, placing it in his small white bowl. Erlang's eyes stayed on the plate at all times while his arms moved continuously. As he stuffed piece after piece into his mouth, he thought to himself, this was made by the princess, no wonder it's so delicious. Xiao Bojian had finally gotten the opportunity to taste Chu Lian's cooking, so he wasn't going to let anyone get the better of him in this situation. Although he appeared to be eating gracefully, his chopsticks weren't any slower than the rest. Although Sanlang's expression remained stormy, he didn't give the others any chances. The scene over at Chu Lian's table was much better. After all, it was only Chu Lian, Princess Wei, and Royal Princess Duanjia seated there. Prince Wei's estate had never followed the ancient custom of remaining silent during a meal, but today was the exception with everyone busy gulping down their food. There wasn't much meat on a single roast duck in the first place, so it didn't stand any chance against the 5 grown men at the table. In less than 5 minutes, the duck was completely gone. Chapter 494, Dinner Conversation 1. The 5 men were still unsatisfied. Since Prince Wei was present, they even had to leave the very last piece for him. This was the young prince's own home, so the maidservants were watching their masters attentively. When the young prince gave 2 light coughs, one of them hastily bent down to ask for his orders. Lu Tai whispered, "Why are you so tactless? Can't you see that the plates on the table are empty?" The maidservant had a troubled expression on her face after hearing his question. She explained, "Young prince, honored lady and royal princess only made 2 roast ducks. We've already served everything here." What? They had gone to the trouble of specially cooking this food, yet they had only made so little of it. It wasn't even enough to feed a child. Lu Tai really wanted to stomp around in a fit of childish temper. He definitely had to enlighten his sister later. Since there wasn't any roast duck left, all Lu Tai could do was to wave his hand and dismiss the maidservant. He couldn't help looking over at his mother's table. After that one glance, jealousy flared up within him. The mouths of the 3 ladies were all oily from eating. Both plates were still half full. If father wasn't here, he would definitely have gone over to sit at his mother's table shamelessly for more roast duck. Princess Wei usually avoided eating rich foods, but Chu Lian's roast duck was different. It was fat, yet not greasy. It was also crispy and tender. She just couldn't resist eating more of it and she had nothing but praise for Chu Lian's roast duck. Since the roast duck was gone, the men at the other table all regained their composure. Prince Wei took a sip from the wine cup in front of him and said, "I really liked the roast duck that Genie made. Do come to visit more often in the future, child." Chu Lian promptly got up and bobbed in agreement after hearing his words. Prince Wei continued speaking, but this time, his words were directed at Xiao Bojian and He Changjue. This prince has heard that the two of you are currently seeking a wife. Have you found someone suitable yet? Although this prince doesn't interfere with politics, I still have some connections within the capital. Xiao Bojian was surprised that Prince Wei would ask about this. His first instinct wasn't to answer Prince Wei, but to dart a sideways glance at Chu Lian instead. There was a persistent gloom remaining on his face, as if the thought of a major life event like marriage still wasn't enough to lift his spirits. He secretly clenched his fists to control his emotions before respectfully answering Prince Wei, "In response to your highness, I'm currently seeking a wife. This junior doesn't have any blood-related relatives left in this world, so my teacher has been helping me with this matter. It's just that there hasn't been any progress so far." How could there be no progress so far? Xiao Bojian was just lying openly. Old Duking had already mentioned his intention to have him marry his legitimate granddaughter several times. It was just that Xiao Bojian hadn't agreed to it yet. After hearing his response, Prince Wei said, "Since Old Duking will handle this matter, then there is no need for this prince to worry." After saying so, he looked towards He Changjue with an obvious meaning. The tips of He Erlang's ears instantly reddened, replying, "To your highness, my grandmother hasn't found a suitable person yet, but this junior already has someone in mind." Oh. Prince Wei lifted a brow since he wasn't expecting this answer from He Changjue. Was the die-hard bachelor of the capital finally awakening to love? Since that's so, this prince will be the first to wish you all the best for your marriage. If you run into any problems, come look for me. This prince will help you. Prince Wei rarely interfered with the affairs of the noble families in the capital. It was a great surprise that he would be willing to help out with He Changju's marriage. From this, it could be seen that Prince Wei was really fond of He Erlang. He Changjue was pleasantly surprised after hearing this. He immediately stood up to bow in gratitude without thinking about where he was. "Thank you, your highness." Prince Wei kindly waved his hand, unaware that he had sold his precious daughter with just a few sentences. Chapter 495, Dinner Conversation, 2, Chu Lian's eyes widened. She hadn't expected her normally dense second brother-in-law to be so good at grasping opportunities. If he really liked royal Princess Duanjia and was intending to marry her, his biggest obstacles were definitely Prince and Princess Wei. Since he had just managed to get a promise from Prince Wei, they might actually be able to get together. The humor in Chu Lian's smile deepened. She knew that royal Princess Duanjia also had feelings for He Changjue. While the current dynasty was more open-minded than the previous one and women could freely go out to visit their friends, most people still abided by the traditional perspectives of marriage. Marriage was to be decided by the parents. Moreover, the marriages of noble children were often sacrificed for the sake of the family's benefit. Therefore, it was rare for the children of noble families to be able to fall in love before marriage and get the chance to marry each other. Chu Lian was really happy to see that He Erlang and royal Princess Duanjia could possibly become one of those rare couples. Royal Princess Duanjia had been in high spirits and had been constantly sneaking glances at He Erlang for a while. However, after overhearing the exchange between Erlang and her father, her face instantly turned pale. Her big eyes were filled with disappointment and sorrow. She quickly lowered her head to hide her emotions. Chu Lian and royal Princess Duanjia were seated on either side of Princess Wei, so they didn't notice the abrupt change in royal Princess Duanjia's mood. When Prince Wei had invited these juniors over for dinner, his only intention had been to treat them to a meal. During dinner, they didn't talk about anything other than some recent gossip within the capital, as well as Xiao Bojian and He Erlang's respective marriages. There were only 3 ladies at Chu Lian's table, so they naturally talked less than the men. Moreover, the usually talkative royal Princess Duanjia wasn't in the best of moods, so they were almost completely silent throughout dinner. After they were done, Prince Wei dismissed them to return to their own estates. He Erlang was still rubbing the back of his head with a foolish grin as they were leaving. The sight made Royal Princess Duanjia even more furious. Chu Lian followed He Changdi out to the side entrance, where Princess Wei's most trusted servant, senior servant Lan, had already arranged for the horse carriages to wait. Liyue brought leaping clouds over after Chu Lian got on the carriage. Right after He Changdi helped his wife up the carriage, he simply stood there next to the carriage with his hands clasped behind his back. He turned to look at the handsome man standing not too far behind him. His lips suddenly curved upwards in a smirk and he refused the reins that Liyue was trying to hand over. Instead, he stepped onto the carriage and entered the compartment where his wife was. When Xiao Bojian saw this, he instantly tightened his fists under his cloak, his eyes filled with a sinister light, along with envy. One didn't dare say more than needed when he noticed the look in his master's eyes. He could only whisper a reminder, "Master, it's getting late. We have to go back now. Old Duke Ying said he wanted to meet you in the study tonight." Xiao Bojian was standing underneath a begonia tree. It was still chilly during early spring, so the begonia tree was bare without even the slightest hint of green buds. The feeling of the cold wind rustling the hem of his robes matched the cold and disappointment in Xiao Bojian's heart. The scene of He Changdi's obvious flaunting and contempt gave him the urge to tear that man into pieces. "Go!" He growled out a hoarse command, before disappearing into the darkness of the night. The carriage left Prince Wei's estate quickly. Chu Lian had stayed at Prince Wei's estate for the whole day, teaching Royal Princess Duanjia how to make roast duck, as well as entertaining Princess Wei. She finally felt the fatigue sink in once she relaxed in her own carriage. Senior servant Gue and the others had made the carriage very comfortable. Although it looked similar to the carriages used by other noble families on the outside, its interior was meticulously furnished. A carpet with a repeating pattern was spread out inside the carriage. In order to keep the inside warm, the wall was covered with a special type of cloth called flannel that they had found at the northern border. Soft and comfortable pillows were placed on the seats inside the carriage. Once someone sat down, they could relax entirely. Chu Lian had just leaned against a pillow when she felt a bone-piercingly cold aura invading her space. Chapter 496, Chance Encounter with Chu Qijing. 1. Chu Lian's whole body stiffened up. She opened her eyes and looked towards the man that was emitting cold air. "What's wrong?" Chu Lian just couldn't tell why He Changdi was suddenly acting so strangely after a simple trip out. She thought about it, but she couldn't recall triggering him in any way today. He Changdi sat perfectly straight across from her with a stern expression on his face. His cold eyes stared at his wife, who was sitting in an easy manner in front of him. He recalled the scene of Chu Lian and Xiao Bojian meeting at Prince Wei's estate earlier, as well as the infatuation in Xiao Bojian's eyes when he looked at Chu Lian. He knew that his wife didn't have any feelings for the lover from her past life. Moreover, she seemed to detest Xiao Bojian. However, it still felt like a thorn stuck in his heart. There was a sourness that was similar to drinking a whole jar of vinegar. He knew that it was wrong to blame the innocent Chu Lian, but he couldn't help being jealous. He Changdi gripped the fists resting on his knees. He turned his head away and muttered, "Nothing." Chu Lian carefully observed her eccentric husband. She tilted her head and furrowed her brows. A moment later, she suddenly laughed. Her laughter was clear and melodious, like a silver bell. Even Liyue, who was outside escorting the carriage, heard the sound and perked his ears curiously. He Sanlang hadn't expected his wife to burst into laughter at his expense. However, he reacted swiftly despite his annoyance. He pulled Chu Lian into his embrace with lightning speed and covered her alluring red lips with his wide palm. His eyes narrowed dangerously as he directed the full force of his dark gaze at the lovely woman in his arms, as if he wanted to see through her heart by looking her clear eyes. Chu Lian noticed the changes in the depth of his gaze. Staring into his eyes was like falling down a deep well. Finally, she realized that his gaze had taken on a dangerous tint. It was as if she were confined in the arms of a ticking time bomb. How could she continue laughing in this situation? She knew that this wasn't the time to be laughing, so she quickly hid the smile on her face. Her watery eyes stared up at him pitifully, as if she was pleading with him to be magnanimous and to spare her. The corner of He Sanlang's mouth lifted slightly. The dangerous air in his eyes was about to seep out. He slowly bent down and crept closer to Chu Lian. When they were close enough to feel each other's breath, he gradually released his hold over Chu Lian's mouth. In a hoarse voice, he whispered, "It's too late." After saying so, He Sanlang immediately attacked Chu Lian's red lips. She tried her best to mumble around his lips and resist, but He Changde's strong arms held her even tighter. Chu Lian knew that he was a little tyrant, so she gave up on struggling and complied with his intimate actions. He gently parted her teeth before capturing her soft tongue and forcing it into a passionate duel. A moment later, Chu Lian's face and neck were flushed red from the lack of air. Her small hands grasped the lapels of his black robe tightly. The contrast of her pale skin against the darkness of his clothes gave off a strange sense of beauty. Soon afterwards, Chu Lian's hands released his collar and shifted to pushing him away instead. However, He Changde was still pent up with frustration, so he refused to let her retreat. He trapped her soft and sweet body firmly within his arms, keeping her from moving while his lips and tongue continued to plunder her mouth and tease her. He Changde released Chu Lian after he had finally released all the frustration in his chest. By this time, Chu Lian was already breathing heavily with a flushed face. Chu Lian glared at He Changde's cold face and scolded him, "He Changde, do you really think that I don't have a temper?" He Changde froze after hearing what Chu Lian had said. He lowered his eyes and looked at her, a trace of indiscernible uneasiness in his deep gaze. He pressed his lips together, which had turned red from the kiss. He couldn't bring himself to speak the apology that was on the tip of his tongue. Chapter 497, Chance Encounter with Chu Qijing. 2. Chu Lian took a deep breath and used her handkerchief to wipe her swollen lips. She struggled slightly before she was able to break free from He Changde's embrace. Following that, she returned to her seat across from him. She could vaguely sense that He Sanlang's gloomy and depressed mood was related to Xiao Bojian. Perhaps it was due to the way Xiao Bojian had looked at her in Prince Wei's estate. But what did that have to do with her? She wasn't the original Chu Lian. She had already done her best to distance herself from Xiao Bojian. It wasn't her fault that she had encountered Xiao Bojian at Prince Wei's estate today. He Sanlang was being unreasonable by venting his anger on her. Although it was his fault, he couldn't even bring himself to apologize now. Even if he had his pride, he should also be able to distinguish right from wrong. She was usually able to tolerate He Sanlang's weird temperament. However, she was genuinely angry today. There had been something she wanted to ask him about, but now that the two were locked into a cold war, there was no chance to speak. Actually, Chu Lian was rather meek and good-natured. She wouldn't make trouble for someone unless they provoked her first. Moreover, there weren't many things that she cared about in the Great Wu dynasty. Thus, her personality had become even more carefree and easygoing. He Changde had truly provoked Chu Lian's temper now. On one hand, it was because Chu Lian genuinely cared for him. On the other hand, He Sanlang's actions had been utterly infuriating. Chu Lian leaned against the pillow. Her pair of clear almond-shaped eyes were shut, as if she no longer wanted to see the man across from her. There was a gloomy atmosphere inside the small carriage. It was so quiet that even the turning of the axles on the carriage could be heard. Chu Lian propped her head on one arm and closed her eyes. It was hard to tell if she had fallen asleep. He Changdi kept his eyes fixed on Chu Lian's beautiful face. There was an unprecedented sense of regret in his heart. He loosened and tightened his fists. The frustration in his chest built up until his chest felt like it was going to explode. He parted his thin lips and took a deep breath. He was about to apologize when the carriage abruptly stopped and Leiyu's voice sounded from outside. "Third young master, third young madam, a carriage broke down ahead so the road is blocked." He Changdi was interrupted by Leiyue just as he was about to speak. Thus, his face immediately became as black as the bottom of a pot. He gritted his teeth and forced out 3 words, "Take a detour." After he finished speaking, his gaze turned towards Chu Lian, only to see her acting as if nothing had happened. She was still leaning against the pillow with her eyes shut, like she was asleep. He Samlang's fragile heart tightened, as if it had just been ruthlessly squeezed. For some unknown reason, Leiyue felt a chill down the back of his neck when he heard his master's voice. He hunkered into his shoulders, lifted the reins, and was about to order the guards to take a detour. However, before the carriage had even moved, Leiyue noticed a familiar figure. A troubled expression appeared on his face. He could more or less guess that third young master and madam were probably fighting. However, he couldn't pretend not to see the person that had just gotten out of the carriage in front of them. Thus, he mustered up some courage to report, "Third young master, the person in the carriage before us is the second master of Hao Xing. The original Chu Lian's father, Chu Qijing." He Changdi couldn't just take a detour now, since he now knew that it was his father-in-law's carriage that had broken down in the middle of the road. Although Chu Lian wasn't treated well during her maiden days in Hao Xing, Chu Qijing was still her biological father. He was the person who had given her life. Chu Lian, who had been resting, also opened her eyes now. She didn't look at He Changdi and turned her head towards the waiting Leiyue outside. She instructed, "Invite second master to come sit in our carriage." Chapter 498, Father-in-law's Invitation, 1. Leiyue hesitated for a moment. When he didn't hear any orders from He Changdi, he guessed that his master was allowing it. He got off his horse and led a few guards over to meet the second master of Hao Xing. Chu Lian lifted the curtain flap, intending to disembark the carriage to welcome Chu Qijing herself. However, the cool-faced He Changdi suddenly reached out to grasp the hand she was using to lift the carriage curtain. "It's cold outside, I'll go welcome father-in-law by myself." When Chu Lian saw how firm his grip on her hand was, she sent He Changdi a warning look, but she didn't continue her action. Chu Lian took her hand back and sat still. He Changdi's heart twisted into knots. His fingers curled up into a fist. When Chu Lian had pulled her hand away from his grasp, it felt as if a piece of his heart had been taken away along with it. He lowered his head and nimbly leaped off the carriage. Chu Qijing and his manservant were quickly brought over to the carriage by Leiyue. He Changdi greeted Chu Qijing cordially with a closed-fist salute. "Father-in-law." Chu Qijing cast a measuring gaze over the handsome, heroic young man before him. The more he looked, the more he found himself liking the young man. At the same time, there was a hint of dissatisfaction in his heart. Why was a young man with such potential wasted on that jinx Chu Lian? He could have been married to Miss Yuan instead. However, Chu Qijing kept these thoughts to himself without displaying them on his face. He smiled and made some casual chat with his son-in-law. "Zixiang, now that the emperor has entrusted you with an important position, you have to do your best to work for the court. We haven't shared some wine for a while, so why don't you come and visit the Ying estate with Lianer in 2 days' time? Lianer's mother misses her." He Sanlang-eyed the tall, clean-shaven middle-aged man in front of him and resisted the urge to laugh. He had been married to Chu Lian for almost a year, and this was the first time his father-in-law had invited him to his estate. This was likely due to his newly bestowed title of Marquis. He Changdi didn't reject the invite and accepted it instead, in order to protect his wife's dignity in front of her father. Chu Qijing treated him like a promising junior family member and patted He Changdi's shoulder in familiarity. Lianer is still young. He'll have to depend on you to take care of her in the days ahead. If not for his experience in his past life, he might have thought that Chu Qijing was a kind father who cared for his daughter. As you say, father-in-law. This son-in-law will take good care of Lianer. She will never experience any suffering at all. Chu Qijing showed an amiable smile. Father will rest assured with your promise. He Changdi invited Chu Qijing up the carriage. He waited until the curtain was let down before he mounted his beloved steed, Leaping Clouds. With a wave of his hands, the carriage started rolling along again. Within the carriage, Chu Qijing settled down in He Changdi's original seat. The moment he sat down, his expression turned thunderous. He glared at Chu Lian, who was slowly opening her eyes, and scolded her. "Where are your manners?" Chu Lian lazily looked up at the black-faced Chu Qijing and chuckled. It was a rather strange day. Why was it that everyone she met today was trying to make her mad? Was she supposed to just take it lying down? Chu Lian wasn't someone with a lot of forbearance. She preferred giving as good as she got. Chu Qijing wasn't her real dad anyway, so there wasn't any need to respect him. Well, isn't that the fault of my dear father? Otherwise, I might have manners as good as my 8th sister. You. Chu Qizheng's face was flushed red with anger from his daughter's words. It was out of his expectations that the personality of his timid and careful daughter would change so much. He clenched his fists and managed to swallow his frustration for the moment. Miss Lian, don't think that father won't be able to reprimand you now that you're Marchioness on Yuan. Let me tell you. No matter how high your status rises, you'll always be a member of my Chu family and the daughter of Chu Qijing. TL note, if you like family drama, try reading, translated by Etvo, for more face slapping. Chapter 499, Father-in-law's Invitation, 2, Chu Lian cast an idle look over the red-faced Chu Qijing. Father, don't you know that married daughters are like spilled water? Since you know that I'm Marchioness on Yuan now and not House Ying's 6th Miss Chu, don't tell me that you're not familiar with the law of the Great Wu dynasty. When a noble house is to be eliminated, it doesn't include daughters who have married out of the house. This time, Chu Qijing was unable to hold back his next flare of temper. He had never gotten talked back to in this manner before. However, knowing that He Changdi was right outside and close to the carriage, he didn't dare to let his raised hand land on Chu Lian's tender cheek. He took in a few deep breaths before sneering, "So you're a slut, just like your mother." The mother he had mentioned wasn't his current wife and Miss Yuan's mother, of course, but his deceased first wife. Chu Lian had taken on an indifferent attitude at first, since Chu Qijing was intent on bullying her no matter what. She wasn't going to just bear the brunt of his temper silently, but she wasn't motivated to do anything but talk back at him. However, Chu Qijing had taken things a step further. She would have been fine if he reprimanded her alone, but now he was even insulting his original wife, who had passed away many years ago. This was something that crossed the line for Chu Lian. Chu Lian's gaze turned sharp. "Father, I finally understand why you don't have any heirs. Someone as dreadful as you deserves to be the last of the family line." The greatest pain in Chu Qizheng's life was the fact that he didn't have any sons. Chu Lian had just mercilessly brought it up in front of him, bearing his insecurities completely. He almost fainted from the rage that overcame him. Just as he was about to retort, Chu Lian interrupted him. "Father, it's best to save your breath, lest you spit up blood out of anger." Chu Qizheng's face was now a steely white. His breathing turned into rough pants. It took him a good while to finally get his emotions under control. He glared at Chu Lien, unresigned to his defeat, but he decided against speaking any further. It was good that he had finally shut up. Chu Lien was too lazy to bother wasting her breath on him now. She picked up a teacup that had been placed to the side and took light sips of honey water. After a long period of silence, Chu Qijing managed to calm himself enough to say, "In a few more days, come back to the Ying estate with Marquis An Yuan. Your younger sister is about to get engaged." Chu Lien didn't make any response or acknowledgement, but Chu Qijing took it as if she had heard him. He shot a sideways glance at her, his eyes glittering. His eldest daughter had grown into a delicate and lovely beauty. Her tiny figure shone with a natural, elegant aura. It was those almond-shaped eyes of hers that resembled his first wife the most. Every time he looked at Chu Lien, the anger he held towards that woman kept flaring up. As the carriage carried along on its way, Chu Qijing shut his eyes. Out of sight, out of mind. He Changdi's ears were sharp, so he had heard every single word of the conversation between father and daughter in the carriage. A corner of his lips curved up. Although his wife looked frail and cute, with an innocent face to boot, her ability to provoke others was unrivaled. He had already been on the receiving end of her skills many times before. However, the humor on He Sanlang's face quickly dissipated, allowing his naturally cold expression to take over once again. At the same time, he delved into deep thought. While he had lived separately from Chu Lien in his past life, he still knew a little of her history. Even in this lifetime, it remained true that House Ying's second master wasn't too fond of his legitimate first daughter. Back then, even after he and Chu Lien had been married for a year, Chu Qijing hadn't graced their doorstep even once. Why was he seemingly so kind-hearted as to invite them over to the Ying estate now? He Sanlang and Chu Lien sent Chu Qijing to the Ying estate before returning to their home. On the way back to the Jinggan estate, He Changdi didn't enter the carriage again to share the ride with Chu Lien. Chu Lien said nothing and simply leaned against a pillow, eyes shut. In the gentle rocking of the carriage, it seemed like she had fallen asleep. Just as they were about to reach the Jinggan estate, a guard came running up to meet them. Perhaps since he had already recognized them from afar, the guard quickly shouted, "Third young master, third young madam, bad news." Chapter 500. Chapter 500, Miscarriage, 1. Still seated in the carriage, Chu Lien slowly opened her eyes, a glint of something flashing across her gaze. The corners of her lips curved upwards with a hint of ridicule as she whispered to herself, "So it's finally come." He Changdi hadn't been in a good mood from the start and his expression was overcast. When the guard came rushing over in a panic shouting his report, the thunder on his face could scare even the boldest of tigers. "What news?" Liua shot the reporting guard a look. Luckily, the guard seemed to have some wits about him and quickly suppressed his emotions. He came over to He Changdi's side and reported more quietly, "Third young master, Miss Maya's hen's child might not make it." After saying so, the guard lowered his head, unable to face third young master's stormy gaze. The air around He Changdi turned frosty. "What does that have to do with us?" The guard's legs were shaking from having to bear the force of third young master's temper. He trembled and stuttered, but finally, under the pressure of He Changdi's icy aura, he spat out the truth in one go. The doctor said that, Miss Maya's hen's miscarriage was caused by eating the candied hawthorns that third young madam sent over. Candied hawthorns. A cold light filled He Changdi's fathomless eyes. He kept his gaze on the quaking guard before him, his every word emanating a violent chill as he said, "Who sent for the doctor?" The guard didn't dare to hide anything when third young master was in this state. It was the heir. The heir personally sent for the old doctor in Chengde Hall. All right, I've received your report. You're dismissed. Not a single emotion could be heard from He Chang's magnetic voice. The guard, who had fallen to his knees in fear, managed to gather enough courage to look up at third young master and then at the carriage that hadn't even moved. However, in the end, it wasn't enough to make him spit out the rest of the report. He didn't believe that the good-natured third young madam would do such a thing, but from the doctor's testimony and the clear benefits involved, he had no choice but to think that the culprit was indeed third young madam. When he thought of third young madam's lovely visage and how there was a poisonous heart hiding underneath, he couldn't help but tremble. The main branch of the Jingon estate had no heirs. Miaojin had invited a doctor specializing in gynecology to make a diagnosis a few months after getting pregnant. The doctor had mentioned that there was an 80% chance of the child being a boy. Although there hadn't been any official announcements made, the whole estate knew that both Countess Jingon and Matriarch had great expectations for the child in Maya's hen's belly. Countess Jingon had even kept Miaojin by her side to keep an eye on things, afraid that there would be some unfortunate accident. Who could have thought that problems would arise when Miaojin was this far along? Now that the possibility of a male heir for the main branch was gone, if third young madam were to fall pregnant, she would give birth to the very first little young master of House Jingon. What a scheme! Liuyuan knew that third young madam had made candied hawthorns for Countess Jingon yesterday, so he hurriedly explained, "Third young master, it definitely wasn't third young madam. There must be some explanation for this." He Changdi turned to look at the anxious Liuyue, but he didn't say anything besides instructing the party to hurry back to the estate. Liuyue couldn't tell what was going on in his master's mind. However, he knew that third young madam and third young master seemed to have quarreled earlier. Now that this matter had suddenly arisen, his master wouldn't really think that this had anything to do with third young madam, right? News spread fast. In just a short moment, even Xian, who was sitting in the carriage behind them, knew of the matter. Her face immediately turned ashen. She remembered what Chu Lian had said to Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia when they had been eating the so-called hawthorn balls and clenched her fists as her thoughts raced. Who was trying to pin the blame on their third young madam? Chapter 501. Chapter 501, Miscarriage. 2. The young couple quickly made it back to their estate. Once they were behind the screen of the main entrance, the carriage rolled to a stop and He Changdi dismounted from his horse. In a few quick strides' time, he was already beside the carriage. The moment he shoved the curtain flap out of the way, He Changdi was immediately met with Chu Lian's startled gaze. The dim light of the evening under the shade of the privacy screen and He Changdi's tall figure were enough to obscure anyone else from peeking into the carriage. Chu Lian's first reaction upon meeting her husband's gaze was stunned amazement. For some reason, her mood lightened up. "Do you really think that I'm not the culprit?" He Changdi nodded his head as the ice on his face melted a little. He tucked some loose strands of hair behind her ear in a show of affection. "Why? You're really trusting me just like that?" Chu Lian was curious. Everyone else likely thought of her as the culprit behind this matter. Furthermore, they had just been squabbling. He Sanlang suddenly bent over to place a gentle kiss on her lips. His voice was soft as he stated, "My Lianer isn't that stupid." Chu Lian was rather satisfied with his answer. This proved that her husband wasn't a complete idiot and that he did love her. The sacrifices she had made hadn't gone to waste after all. Chu Lian let out a crafty smirk, but she didn't reveal the cards in her hand to He Changdi. Her test of He Sanlang's faith in her had only just begun. He Changdi's expression suddenly turned stern. "Lianer, I want you to act along with me." Their enemies were still hidden while they were exposed in the open. They needed to put on a show to get their enemies to reveal themselves. When Xian alighted from the second carriage, she happened to see third young master walking away coldly from the first carriage. Liyue turned to shoot her a troubled look. Xian stared after third young master straight back, icy tendrils of fear creeping into her heart. Did third young master not believe in their third young madam? Xian's face turned pale at the thought. By the time she managed to regain her senses, she saw that Chu Lian had lifted the curtain and was about to get off the carriage. She quickly blinked away the sour tears in her eyes and went up to help her. It was only when she was close enough to her master that she noticed how pale and fragile her master looked under the hazy glow of the lantern lights around them. Her tiny face was tense with worry and the blood had drained away from her cheeks, making her seem like a delicate porcelain doll that would break at the slightest touch. Xian's heart hurt for her master. When had her lively and willful third young madam ever looked so down? She lost control of her emotions and the wetness in her eyes overflowed. This was exactly like how things had been back in the Ying estate. Afraid that her mood would affect Chu Lian, she quickly tried to reassure her master by whispering, "Third young madam, please stay strong. Didn't you say it yourself? Those candied hawthorns you made weren't actual hawthorns." Chu Lian turned to Xian with a weak smile. If she didn't have to support Chu Lian right now, Xian might have covered her mouth and burst into tears. Although she knew that this matter had nothing to do with third young madam, what use was that when third young master didn't believe in her? The one on the losing end was still third young madam. Though Chu Lian seemed like she didn't have any energy left and her complexion was rather pallid, she still rushed over to Countess Jean Gan's courtyard as soon as she could. The lights were burning brightly in the courtyard and the parlor was full of people. Even the grounded Madame Zhou was present. Countess Jean Gan and Matriarch He sat at the head of the room. To the matriarch's side was He Ying and her daughter. As for Madame Zhou, she was seated by Countess Jean Gan's side. The eldest son, He Changqi, was standing to the side speaking to an old doctor, while Great Dr. Miao was seated with his medicinal chest placed nearby, sipping his tea without a care in the world. Chapter 502 Chapter 502, Slander, 1. When He Changdi stepped into the brightly lit parlor, practically everyone's eyes were focused on him. His jet-black robes and perfectly straight posture, as well as the way he emerged from the darkness, made him look like an impartial and upright authority about to impose justice. He Changdi's handsome face was rather serious and grim. His gaze swept over everyone in the parlor as if he could see into everyone's hearts. Finally, he stood in the middle of the parlor, as if he was awaiting an explanation from those gathered here. Ever since He Sanlang had become a marquis, his position in House Jingan had gone beyond what it had been before. Those who were originally slightly afraid of third young master were now completely silent from fear. Even Matriarch He and Countess Jean Gan weren't able to bring themselves to speak for a moment when they looked at He Changdi. This was especially so for Countess Jean Gan, who felt a little guilty. Madame Zhou was watching from the side with as much patience as she could muster. The silence of the more senior members of the family at such a crucial time made her anxious and nervous. There was only one chance. If she missed it, who knew when the next one would come, if ever? The parlor became so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. The wife of the heir, Madame Zhou, pinched her palm to bring tears to her eyes before lowering her head to weep. Third brother, you're still young, so you won't understand your eldest brother's plight. It was my fault in the past for not being considerate enough to your brother. It took so much for your brother to finally have hopes for an heir. He would have had a son to hold in just a few more months, yet his hopes have been crushed so suddenly. It's so painful, it's unbearable. Although the child didn't come from my womb, I would still have been mother to him once born. With those words said, it seemed as if Madame Zhou lost all control of her emotions as she began to sob uncontrollably with grief. Those not in the know might actually think that the lost child was hers instead. A cold glint that flashed through He Changdi's eyes. His thin lips pressed into a grim smile and the words fell out of his mouth like ice. What do you mean by that, sister-in-law? Madame Zhou sent a signal to the physician standing beside He Changqi with her eyes. She used a handkerchief to wipe away the tears on her cheeks and took a deep breath, as if she was doing her best to appear composed. Third brother, you're young and you haven't been married for long. You've also been through a lot with your wife in the northern border, so I can understand you being protective of her. However, the evidence is undeniable, there's no way that you can defend her now. Standing outside the parlor, Chu Lian could hear every single word her sister-in-law, Madame Zhou, had said. She sneered inwardly. Madame Zhou was already unable to hold back her scheming this early into the game. Wasn't she afraid of pushing herself into a corner? The sight of her master's pale face and Madame Zhou's slander pushed Xian to the brink of her temper. She bit her lip so hard that she almost drew blood. Let's go in, Chu Lian muttered weakly. Xian held up her master with all her might, almost as if she were trying to take on her burden instead. She blinked repeatedly, holding in her tears with everything she had. When they reached the parlor's entrance, the two maidservants who guarded the entrance lifted the curtains on either side and Xian guided Chu Lian in. The moment Chu Lian stepped into the parlor, the gazes of everyone inside fell upon her like a physical weight. He Ying, who was seated beside the matriarch, sneered, well, it looks like the culprit is finally here. I thought she was going to hide for the whole night. He Changdi couldn't help turning his head to look at Chu Lian as well. When he noticed how pale she looked, his pupils shrunk and his body turned subconsciously with the desire to stand by his wife's side. However, recalling the promise they made in the carriage, he firmly restrained himself. The hands held behind his back tightened into fists. Chapter 503. Chapter 503, Slander, 2, Chu Lian kept her head down. She didn't meet the eyes of anyone in the parlor. With Xian supporting her, she took a few steps forward and bent her knees to greet her elders. Although her complexion was bad, her posture remained upright. Before anyone could question her, she looked up and fired off a blunt question, Grandmother, Mother, do you actually believe that I'm the culprit behind this? The overbearing attitude Chu Lian showed was a complete opposite to the frail woman who had walked in with the aid of her handmaid. This sudden turnaround caught both Matriarch He and Countess Jingon by surprise and frightened Madame Zhou. After Chu Lian's straightforward question, she looked directly into the eyes of the matriarch and her mother-in-law. She could see that her question had shaken them from their original beliefs. Without giving them any chance to reply, she continued, have you considered what I would actually gain from doing such a thing? This may be a pompous thing for me to say, but my husband is already a marquis. A marquis is a whole rank above a count. In the future, my husband and I will have to move away from this estate and my husband's title will be passed down to his children. Eldest brother doesn't have any male heirs now, but even if Miaozhen doesn't have a child, who is to say that he can't take another concubine in a few more years? Why worry about lacking an heir? Chu Lian's words were like a thunderbolt, shaking Countess Jingon out of the fog she had been in. That was true. If this had all happened before He Changdi had earned his noble title, then there might have been some benefit for Chu Lian in doing so, but now it didn't make sense at all. What good would it even do for her if the child died? The title of Count Jingon wouldn't be passed down to her child anyway. Besides, there was still her second brother-in-law, He Changjue, in the way. When it came down to the family's problem of not having any little young masters in the next generation, how could an illegitimate son from a servant-born concubine compare to the legitimate son of a noble wife? She and the matriarch had been so engrossed with losing a male heir that they weren't thinking clearly. However, even though Countess Jingon had managed to think things through, it didn't mean that the others had been enlightened too. Matriarchy's eyes were still clouded. She was already old and her eldest grandson was still without an heir. Although she didn't voice her worries, it had been weighing on her heavily. Matriarchy's eyes were cast downwards and she remained silent. Chu Lian had been observing her expression all the while and was able to tell that the matriarch didn't actually agree with what she just said. Madame Zhou didn't speak either, but her tension could be seen from how tightly she was grasping her handkerchief. She lowered her head as she didn't dare to look at Chu Lian, enduring the jealousy and hatred she held inside. Madame Zhou was afraid that someone would notice something if she looked up, or she might reveal some clues if she argued with Chu Lian. With everyone's attention turned elsewhere, she let out a crafty smirk on her face. Even if she kept silent, there was someone else who would speak out. As expected, that person didn't let her down. "Miss Chu, did you really think that we'd believe you just like that? Quit dreaming. How do you explain the hawthorns that you sent then?" The cowardly Ying put on a fierce performance and acted as if she was an extremely upright individual. Pan Nianjun was seated obediently beside her mother with a timid expression. She looked around constantly following the drama. While there was a sympathetic expression on her face, she was actually utterly delighted within. Out of everyone in House Jingan, she envied Chu Lian the most. She wasn't just jealous of the restaurant that Chu Lian had opened, which made thousands of taels every month. There was also the fact that Princess Wei had taken a liking to Chu Lian, that royal Princess Duanjia was her good friend, but most importantly, she had taken the position of Yi Changde's wife. Chu Lian was just a nobody from a third-rate noble family renowned for its fertile young misses. How was that any better than her? As for her silly noble title, even an honored lady was at a loss for words in the face of the interrogation from the elders in the family. What a joke! Chu Lian's clear eyes met with He Ying's smug look. For some reason, the confidence that He Ying had in her accusation deflated under the full attention of those limpid eyes. The corner of Chu Lian's lips curved upwards. Chapter 504. Who said the child is beyond saving? 1. Aunt, if my memory serves me correctly, I am still the honored Lady Genie, a title which was personally conferred by the Emperor. The meaning behind her words was that He Ying had no right to call her Miss Chu. After all, He Ying was just a commoner with nothing to her name. Chu Lian's words were like a fist clenched around He Changde's heart. His expression showed how displeased he was. As he looked at his wife's delicate figure, there was a prick of pain in his heart. When Chu Lian had spoken, she hadn't mentioned her authority as Marchioness on Yuan, and had fallen back on her title as Honored Lady Genie instead. Although the Honored Lady title had given her the status of an honorary member of the imperial family, it was still a few ranks below the wife of a marquis, who was automatically given a first-rank noble title. Insecurity ate at He Sanlang from within. He couldn't help allowing his imagination to run wild. Could it be that his wife hadn't acknowledged him and had never thought of relying on him? Eldest Madame He Ying was completely shut down by those words from Chu Lian. Her face turned deathly white and her lips trembled as she struggled to speak. According to their customs, even as a senior family member, He Ying was supposed to curtsy towards Chu Lian in her capacity as an honored lady. This was similar to how it would be for ladies who entered the palace and became imperial concubines. When imperial concubines returned to their maiden homes for a visit, the elders in her family would have to kneel and kowtow to her in deference to her title. Chu Lian had never exercised that right on eldest Madame He Ying before, because she respected the matriarch. However, now that matriarch he simply wasn't worthy of her respect anymore, was there any need to be mindful of He Ying's pride? Did she really think that Chu Lian was an easy target to bully? You! How dare you speak to me like this? I am your senior. He Ying was utterly flustered. In her anger, her face contorted into an ugly expression. Enough! The matriarch finally spoke. She raised her voice with an authoritative tone. Sanlang's wife, does this old lady need to get up and greet you as well? So the matriarch has finally decided to shed all pretenses. Humph. Chu Lian lowered her head slightly to hide the mocking smile on her lips as the tension in her chest faded away. She wasn't afraid of going up against the matriarch, she had only been worried about hurting someone who truly cared for her. What matriarch he just said had completely depleted all the goodwill that Chu Lian had left for her. It was better this way. She wouldn't have to deal with the burden of guilt in the aftermath, and it would be easier to talk back to her. Seeing that the matriarch was on her side, He Ying's contorted face immediately turned into a proud smile. That smile was as infuriating as any smile could get. He Changdi clenched his fists. It took the last shreds of his patience to stop himself from going up to Chu Lian, taking her into his arms, and shielding her from all this. Madame Zhou was also smirking on the inside. On the other hand, Countess Jean Gan's expression had slowly morphed into a frown. She opened her mouth, thinking to persuade the matriarch, but looking at the terrible complexion of her mother-in-law, she decided against aggravating the situation further. Chu Lian bowed slightly. I dare not. Matriarch, he slammed the table beside her, causing the teacup that had been placed there to crash to the ground. You dare not. What else could you possibly dare not to do? Chu Lian kept her head lowered and maintained her silence. Matriarch, he gripped the edge of the table and glanced at He Changdi. Seeing that he hadn't moved an inch and didn't seem to have the intention to intervene at all, relief washed over her. In her mind, she thought that her grandson probably had something against his wife as well. After finding out that Chu Lian had been kidnapped in the northern border, matriarch, he had become estranged from Chu Lian. With He Ying's multiple attempts at sowing discord between them, the aged matriarch who had become increasingly muddle-headed was now biased against Chu Lian. She absolutely wasn't going to relent now. Dr. Qian, please explain the situation and let us hear if I'm wrongly accusing her. Having received permission from the matriarch, the doctor who had been standing quietly beside He Changqi immediately walked into the center of the parlor. He started off with a respectful bow towards the matriarch. Dr. Qian was dressed in a gray robe. He had a long face and his eyes were large but murky, as if there was something darker hidden in their depths. Matriarch, this humble one has already taken Miss Mayasen's pulse 3 times. Miss Mayasen's miscarriage was indeed caused by overconsumption of hawthorns. After listening to Dr. Qian, the matriarch turned to the heir apparent, He Changqi. Dalong, speak. He Changqi had a haggard expression, evidently grieving over his lost child. Although he usually seemed indifferent about the matter, no noble would be happy about lacking an heir. Despite all that, he was still much more rational than matriarch he was. Grandmother, although it was my personal attendant who called Dr. Qian here, it's better if a proper investigation is held. I don't think this matter is that simple. He Ying hadn't expected such a sentiment from her oldest nephew at a time like this. Infuriated, she pelted him immediately with reprimands. Dalong, think about what you just lost. That was your own flesh and blood. Why are you still speaking up for others? He Changdi's face tensed up. He turned to look at He Ying with his thick brows furrowed tightly. Matriarch, he ignored the dispute between her daughter and grandson and questioned Chu Lian instead. Sanlang's wife, do you have anything more to say? He Ying and her daughter were overjoyed within. Look at what had become of honored Lady Jeannie, the Marchioness on Yuan. See how far she had fallen. Even the husband standing right beside her hadn't spoken up for her at all. What a pitiful sight. Chu Lian was just about to speak when a heartbroken scream was heard from the inner room. Oh! Following immediately after was the sound of panicked footsteps and maidservants talking. My child! My dear child! The woman's voice was hoarse and filled with despair, as if she was carrying anger that she didn't have the energy to express. Chu Lian had heard this voice before and she knew that it belonged to Miaozhen. Next, the voice of an old servant resounded with comforting platitudes. Lady Miaozhen, the child is gone. It has already died in your womb. If we don't take it out, you'll lose your life as well. No, I don't want to, my child isn't dead, he isn't dead. Please, please don't take away my child. Chapter 505, Who Said the Child is Beyond Saving? 2. Even Chu Lian was feeling some sympathy for Miaojin by this point, so Changqi had it even worse. Madame Zhou caught sight of the heartache and guilt that flashed across his expression. Even as she showed a frown on her face, a perverted sense of enjoyment rose in her heart. Miaohen's tragic wails could be heard in the parlor from time to time, causing everyone's expressions to sink. Even though Chu Lian had ways to absolve herself from suspicion, this wasn't a good time to speak. It was right at this time that great Dr. Miao, who had been acting as a bystander, picked up his medicine box and walked to the middle of the parlor. He stroked his white beard and said with a wide smile, "What's wrong? Why are you all fretting so? Matriarch, so much worrying isn't good for your health. Isn't it just a child? Who said the child is beyond saving?" His casual words downplayed the situation and shocked everyone to the core. Matriarch He and Countess Jingon were so surprised that they leapt out of their seats. They stared at him with disbelief, as if he had just spoken in gibberish. "What did you just say? The child can still be saved?" Countess Jingon asked in a soft voice. Before great Dr. Miao could nod, Dr. Qian retorted aggressively, "You old fogey, what kind of nonsense are you spouting? I took Miss Miaohen's pulse myself, her child is already dead in her womb." "Exactly. How is that even possible? Miaojin bled so much." Madame Zhou couldn't bear it any longer. Fear and alarm warred within her heart. If Miaohen's child could actually be saved, wouldn't all her efforts go to waste? As she spoke, she kept shooting signals at Dr. Qian with her eyes. The smirk on great Dr. Miao's eyes deepened as he took in the expressions of every person in the parlor. "You wouldn't let me take a look earlier. Well, now that you've all determined that the child has perished, what harm is there in letting me do it now? It's not like things can get any worse." Great Dr. Miao's words couldn't get any more blunt, but everything he had said was true. They had already accepted the worst possible outcome. If he managed to save the baby, wouldn't it be an unexpected surprise? They weren't stupid, so Changqi immediately said, "Lead great Dr. Miao in." A senior servant immediately led great Dr. Miao into the inner room. Chu Lian hadn't thought that great Dr. Miao still had something up his sleeves at such a crucial time. As great Dr. Miao entered the room, Madame Zhou and Dr. Qian's expressions turned a little strange. Everyone had abruptly lost the mood to interrogate their suspect. Madame Zhou herself was feeling guilty, so she couldn't be bothered with Chu Lian at this moment. It would also be hard for Ying to go up against Chu Lian alone, so as much as she wanted to, she couldn't act right now. Chu Lian was helped over to a seat at the side of the parlor by Xian. Changdi casually took a seat right beside her. No one noticed as husband and wife exchanged gazes. There was a profound look in Changdi's eyes. He was getting overwhelmed by his emotions, and the desire to take her away from this place was growing. He reached his hand out to take hold of the small hand that Chu Lian had rested on the side table. Chu Lian immediately noticed his intentions and quickly drew her hand away. She subtly shook her head at him. Since she had made it this far, she couldn't squander all of their efforts. There were still some people who hadn't shown themselves. She also wanted to make Changdi understand that she would be able to resolve this matter without a scratch even without him. She wanted to show him that she wasn't a woman who had to rely on a man for everything. Similarly, she had the same expectations for her man. They were husband and wife, not master and dependent. They had to stand shoulder to shoulder as equals. Changdi was feeling a little depressed and empty inside. In this moment, he could somehow sense that Chu Lian would be able to live happily even on her own, if he ever messed up his relationship with her. When his thoughts veered in that direction, it felt as if his heart had been pierced by a million needles. He withdrew his hand and formed it into a fist. Impossible. As long as he willed it, even if he had to tie her down to keep her with him, he wouldn't give her any chance to escape. Everyone in the parlor was thinking of different things, while most of them were absent-mindedly awaiting news from the inner room. 15 minutes later, when they could no longer hear the anguished wails of Miaujin, the inner room gradually quietened down. In another 15 minutes, everyone was starting to become impatient. Having spent so much time in silence, Changqi was now icily calm. As the eldest son of the family, he was more thoughtful than most. After some consideration, he broke the silence by saying, "It seems like Great Dr. Miao can't provide us any answers anytime soon. Grandmother, mother, third brother, third sister-in-law, it's getting late. You should all go and take a rest, I'll stay here to keep watch." Countess Jingon found her son's words reasonable. When she saw how exhausted the matriarch looked, she realized that it was indeed better if they didn't continue waiting here and voiced out her agreement. In the end, everyone returned to their courtyards to rest. When Chu Lian and He Changdi left, they left with him in the lead and her lagging behind, so that those who were attentive would see that there was a problem between them. While supporting matriarch He out of the parlor, Muxiang glared at Chu Lian's figure with hatred. Her red lips parted in a malicious sneer, giving her the appearance of a monster looking at its prey. Back at Qingxi Hall, Muxiang helped the matriarch freshen up before taking her leave and entering a small study. She beckoned a maidservant over and whispered into the maidservant's ear. The green-clothed servant nodded and left Qingxi Hall, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Chapter 506, Snitch 1. Over at a side entrance to Songtao Court, an anxious figure was pacing around in the cold wind beneath the dim lantern light. Finally, after a long period of waiting, a light rapping sounded from the other side of the door. The shadowy figure stiffened before swiftly moving to open it. The person outside handed over a letter and made 2 hand gestures. They left as quickly as they had come. One side of Fuyin's face came to light under the lanterns, the wavering shadows blurring her expression and contorting her features. She hastily stuffed the letter into her clothes and looked around the side entrance once again. After a few more furtive glances about and confirming that no one had noticed her actions, she quickly departed from the scene. It was around this time that Chu Lian and He Sanlang returned to Songtao Court. Senior servant Gui's eyes widened a little when she saw the young couple entering separately, one after the other. Her heart leaped into her throat. Senior servant Gui knew that something was wrong when she saw Chu Lian entering the bathroom without saying a word to third young master. Taking the chance when He Changdi left for the study, she pulled Xian aside for some questioning. What happened? Wasn't third young madam fine when she went out this morning? Xian didn't have much in the way of an explanation as she was still confused by the chain of events. Momo, I'm not really sure either. It seems like third young madam and master fought on the road back. Also, we ran into second master on the way. Xian's face was also filled with worry. Her heart was still quaking from the showdown in Countess Jingan's courtyard. Senior servant Gui showed an expression of deep thought. She sternly ordered, "Give me more details." Of Chu Lian's 4 handmaids, it was Xian and Wenlan who were on the late-night shift tonight. As the hour was late, handmaids who weren't on night duty could return to their room to rest. He Changdi was seated at the desk in the study. The tranquil night was especially quiet, strangely so. Only the occasional crackling from the lanterns broke the silence. He Changdi's dark eyes stared into the emptiness before him. He propped his head on his hand as if he was thinking about something. No one would have been able to guess that his mind was filled with Chu Lian's figure. Her conversation with Chu Qijing inside the carriage. Their agreement behind the screen at the entrance. Her indifference towards him. Also, when she addressed herself as Honored Lady Jeannie while arguing with Aunt He suddenly felt an impending sense of crisis. He didn't want to continue playing out this farce any longer. This was obviously torture for him. The hand that Sanlang had rested on top of the desk suddenly clenched into a tight fist. The veins on the back of his hand bulged out from the tension in his limb. He abruptly stood up, wanting to leave the study. However, at this time, someone knocked on the door. Changdi paused for a second before narrowing his dark eyes. Perhaps due to the lack of response from within the room, his late-night visitor knocked on the door once more. This time, the knocking was accompanied by a woman's dulcet tones. "Third young master, this servant has come to serve you some tea." It was Fuyan's voice. A corner of Changdi's lips curled up in a mocking smirk. "Enter." The door to the study was opened with a creak from the outside. Over at the parlor, Chu Lian was drinking a bowl of white fungus lotus seed soup when Baicha came in to report. "Third young madam, this servant saw it in person. It's Fuyan." At this moment, the people around Chu Lian were all her most trusted servants. Xian, Wenlan, and senior servant Gui all had shocked expressions on their faces. Fuyan. To think it was actually Fuyan. Baicha was so frightened that her face turned deathly pale. After she had been promoted to a second-class maidservant in Songtao Court, she had always been nothing but respectful towards the first-class handmaids. She never expected that a servant so close to their master, like Fuyan, would possess this kind of ulterior motive. Chu Lian's face was calm, as if she had already known about this matter. "Third young madam, this old servant will lead some servants over to catch that slut Fuyan," senior servant Gui said, gnashing her teeth. If it had been Mingyan or Jingyan who committed that sort of betrayal, it wouldn't have been so bad. They wouldn't expect loyalty from them since they were just some outside servants who had been randomly picked by second madam's senior servant right before Chu Lian's wedding. However, it was different for Fuyan and Xian. They had been serving Chu Lian ever since Hao Xing, and they shared several years of friendship with her. Chu Lian raised her hand to halt senior servant Gui's action. "Third young madam." Senior servant Gui protested anxiously. "There's no need to go." Chu Lian's voice was calm. If her relationship with Changdi could be shaken with just a few words from Fuyan, then it would just mean that she had misjudged Changdi as a person. There were so many maidservants in Songtao Court as well as the Jinggan estate. There would be no end to it if she had to keep a constant guard up day and night. But what if Fuyan harms your relationship with third young master? "Momo, don't worry. I have my own plans." Chu Lian patted senior servant Gui's hand. Senior servant Gui couldn't do anything since Chu Lian had given her an order. She couldn't disobey her master. "Momo, have an early rest. It's already pretty late, so I'm going to rest as well. I'll be enough with just Wenlan coming in to serve me." Chu Lian headed back into the bedroom. She let Wenlan prepare her for bed as she sunk into the warm and soft blankets. Wenlan couldn't let go of her worries as she was letting down the bed curtains, so she asked, "Third young madam, should this servant send someone to monitor the situation in the study?" "No need. Do you think your third young master is a fool? He probably knows that Baicha came over to report. There's no need for these useless actions. Go take a rest. I'll call you if I need anything." Wenlan was astonished. A moment later, she nodded and quietly left after putting down the curtains. Chapter 507, Snitch 2. Chu Lian was lying under her soft blankets as she breathed in the faint scent of Chinese agarwood drifting around the bed. It was snug under the covers because Wenlan and the others had warmed them up with a hot water bottle earlier. Despite her warm and comfortable surroundings, Chu Lian wasn't the slightest bit sleepy at all. She blinked hard as she stared up at the begonic-colored canopy of the bed. Her heart felt unsettled for some reason. Although she had read the original novel, she hadn't been able to finish reading it. Moreover, many things had changed since she had arrived in the Great Wu Dynasty, and events had turned out completely different from the novel. It was February right now. Her knowledge of events only lasted until May. She regretted it very much now. She regretted not reading more in the past. She should have at least read the ending first. If she had, then she wouldn't be at a loss for what to do right now. Chu Lian's sleepiness was fading away as she tossed and turned like a pancake. In the end, as she grew more and more awake, memories of her interactions with He Changdi today flashed through her mind unbidden. She had appeared calm in front of senior servant Gue and the others. However, she was the only one who knew if her facade matched what was going on inside her heart. For some reason, her thoughts kept drifting to what Fuyan might be saying to He Changdi in the study right now. After some time had passed, Chu Lian still wasn't sleepy. She got up and opened the curtains, picking up the storybook she had placed on the nightstand and settling in to read. Wenlan heard the sounds coming within the room and came in to take a look. When she saw that Chu Lian had sat up against the headboard and started reading, she hastily trimmed the candlewick to make it brighter in order to avoid any damage to her master's eyes in the dim lighting. Wenlan sighed inwardly as she retreated from the room. Third young madam's words and actions were very different. Someone who would normally fall asleep the moment her head touched the pillow was unusually sleepless tonight. If it wasn't because she was worried about third young master, then what would it be? Inside the study, Fuyan was wearing a brand new light green dress, a pearl hairpin made in the latest style in her hair. Her figure was tall and slender, especially at her waist. Her most attractive feature was her slim and delicate waist. She was holding a tea tray as she swiftly walked towards He Changdi's desk with her head lowered. Fuyan covertly lifted her eyes to peek at the tall and handsome man behind the desk. Her heart instantly began to beat even harder due to her nervous excitement. She held the tea tray in front of He Changdi and said, "Third young master, please have a cup of tea to warm your stomach." He Changdi finally shifted his deep gaze towards Fuyan. His gaze was cold and expressionless. "Leave." Fuyan froze when she heard his command. Although pleasant to the ear, his voice was completely devoid of any emotions. A moment of disbelief made her give pause. She had never thought that third young master would use such a cold and chilly tone to talk to her. She had purposely dressed up today. Didn't people often say that women looked more beautiful under a lantern light? Furthermore, her looks weren't too bad in the first place. She could still be considered a slender and graceful beauty. The manservants at the second entrance would stare at her every time she went out for an errand. How could third young master be so indifferent to her charms? Fuyan secretly bit her lip in anger and clenched her hands. He Changdi was quickly losing his patience when he saw her still standing there. "What are you still doing here?" Scram! Fuyan hadn't thought that third young master would get angry. She trembled with fear and kneeled down immediately. She refused to leave just like that. This was a rare opportunity to come by. Someone had deliberately informed her that third young master and madam had just quarreled. If she didn't take the chance to fan the flames now, then it would be hard to find a better time in the future. Since He Changdi hadn't personally thrown her out yet, she suddenly laid prone on the floor and cried, This servant has an important matter to report to third young master." Fuyan didn't hear any response from He Changdi. With her head lowered, she didn't catch the jeering expression that flashed over He Changdi's handsome face either. She didn't dare to hesitate any more this time. Fuyan hastily took out the letter and moved a couple steps forward on her knees, presenting the letter to He Changdi with both hands. "Third young master, please take a look at this letter. Then you'll understand this servant's sincerity." He Changdi didn't reject her request and took the letter from Fuyan. The writing on the letter looked very familiar. It belonged to Xiao Wujing. However, he didn't open the letter. He stared at the maidservant beside him, his thin lips pressed together without a word. Fuyan panicked when she didn't hear the sound of the letter being opened. She lifted her head in a spurt of bravery and looked towards He Changdi. Taking a deep breath, she said, "Third young master, this is a letter that Mr. Xiao wrote to third young madam. Third young madam is unfaithful to you." Fuyan had gritted her teeth as she blurted out her declaration. Quickly following after, she lifted her head and stared intently at He Changdi's expression. The rage, shock, and regret that she had been expecting. None of those negative emotions appeared. He Sanlang's expression hadn't changed a bit. It was still the same coldly handsome face as always. The evidence that would have churned up a storm of emotions in anyone else hadn't fazed him at all. Fuyan's eyes widened comically until they looked like they were about to pop out of her sockets. Her internal panic was on full display in her expression. Third young master, don't you care about third young madam's infidelity? She has an illicit relationship with Mr. Xiao. She's not being faithful to you. He Changdi suddenly bent down and got closer to Fuyan. His slender fingers caught hold of Fuyan's chin, digging into her tender flesh. The sharp pain on her chin made Fuyan cry out. He Changdi's sinister, icy tone crept into her ears like a slow, winding snake. Even if that were true, how is it any of your concern? Chapter 508, Dealing with Her, 1. Once those words had sunken into her mind, Fuyan didn't even get a chance to speak. She first heard a light crack before an intense pain on her jaw overwhelmed her senses. Her forehead broke out into cold sweat from the pain. She couldn't even close her mouth, so how would she be able to say anything? He Changdi threw her to the ground, where she sprawled out in a pitiful manner. She was in so much pain that she couldn't even straighten her back. He Sanlang had just dislocated her jaw. Following that, He Changdi ordered with a shout, "Servants, come in and take her away." Someone pushed open the door to the study once again from the outside. The person who entered was none other than He Changdi's manservant, Laiyue. Laiyue had come in with 2 guards. With a wave of his hand, they swiftly dragged Fuyan out. After Fuyan was taken away, Laiyue secured the door before reporting to his master. "Third young master, after some investigation, we found that it was someone from Qingxi Hall." "Who is she serving?" "She's a third-ranked maidservant who used to do menial chores in Qingxi Hall. When eldest madam and Miss Pan returned to the estate, senior servant Lu promoted her and assigned her to serve eldest madam. Send someone to keep an eye on her." Laiyue acknowledged the order, but he didn't leave right away. He stood beside He Changdi appearing as if he was hesitating to speak. He Changdi turned a bland look on him. Laiyue felt a chill all over his body and the hesitation in his mind suddenly cleared up. "It's about third young madam. Third young madam's servants already know that Fuyan came in earlier." After listening to Laiyue's report, a trace of panic appeared in He Changdi's eyes. However, he managed to get his emotions under control in short order. "I understand. You're dismissed." Leaving behind that order, He Sanlang abruptly broke into a quick stride and exited the study. He seemed to be going towards the direction of the bedroom. Laiyue was still rooted to the same spot in his confusion. What exactly was going on? Wasn't his master still mad at third young madam? Why did it seem like he was in a rush? Since he couldn't understand it, he decided that it was better to stop thinking about it. A bachelor like him wouldn't be able to understand the goings-on between couples anyways. It would be more practical to just go back to his room earlier and rest. He Changdi slowed down only when he reached the parlor. He suddenly realized that he was still holding the letter in his hand. He paused in his steps and held up the letter in his hand. He stared at it for a few seconds. A shadow fell over Sanlang's eyes and he walked towards the brazier in the parlor. With a quick flick of his hand, the unopened letter fell into the brazier. The greedy flames quickly crept over the paper. It only took a few seconds before the letter turned into a pile of ashes. Sanlang breathed a sigh of relief after he watched the letter turn to dust. The knot of emotions within his eyes seemed to have disappeared along with the letter. He turned around and walked towards the bedroom, his rapid pace betraying his sense of urgency. Wenlan was on the night shift, so she was the one who heard his arrival from the side room. Knowing that it was Changdi, she didn't come out to disturb him. The moment Chu Lian heard the footsteps from outside, she hurriedly put away the storybook and hid inside the blanket. In the darkness, she could sense the other side of the bed sinking in a little. Following that, she was suddenly pulled into a familiar embrace, blanket and all. Before she could even open her eyes, kisses were raining continuously on her face. Finally, her dewy lips were captured, forcing her to open her crystal-clear eyes. He hadn't given Chu Lian any chance to resist. By the time he released her, she was already panting hard with a flushed face. Changdi's expression was strangely calm. He stared at that beautiful and delicate face in front of him and suppressed his burgeoning desires so that he could speak. It was Fuyan. The one who relayed the message was a maidservant who serves Ying. Chu Lian didn't seem surprised by the news. She had already known that Fuyan wasn't loyal to her, but that maidservant was definitely suspicious. Someone from Aunt's side. But this doesn't feel like the way she works. Changdi took off his shoes and got on the bed. He didn't even take off his outerwear and leaned directly against the bed frame, his long arms cradling Chu Lian. He let out a cold snort, breaking the silence. Ying. She's not that smart. She's not responsible for this. The gravity of the matter they were discussing slowly helped to calm the young couple down from their previous intimacy. Chu Lian lifted her head and asked out of curiosity, "Then who do you think is responsible for this?" Sanlang couldn't resist caressing Chu Lian's shoulder with the arm that he had placed around her. Eldest sister-in-law. But I'm not sure about the mastermind behind her. Madame Zhou doesn't have the guts to do this herself. Chu Lian inadvertently thought of the servants under matriarchy. Multiple faces flashed through her mind, but none of them stood out to her. In the end, even her brows had furrowed together. Changdi's thoughtful gaze had returned to Chu Lian's face at some point. The little wrinkles that the frown had made on her face gave him the irresistible urge to smooth them out. He gave in to the desire and reached out to stroke the crease between her brows gently. "Lianer, are you still angry?" Chu Lian was jolted out of her thoughts by his sudden question. She glared at him. "What did Fuyan say to you?" Sanlang suddenly remembered that letter. His eyes narrowed and he hugged the lovely figure in his arms more tightly a moment later. "Nothing much. She was just an ambitious maidservant." His half-hearted attempt at brushing off the topic made Chu Lian even more suspicious. She placed her hands against Changdi's chest and pushed him away slightly. Her brows furrowed even more. "Changdi, do you take me for a fool?" Sanlang was slightly startled by her reaction. He had no choice but to confess the whole truth. "The letter Xiao Bojian wrote to you." Chu Lian. Had she been cursed with bad luck somehow? When had Xiao Bojian written a letter to her? Why didn't she know anything about it? So such an important piece of evidence had been in Fuyan's hands this whole time. Coupled with the feelings that she had for her crazy husband, it was no wonder that she had decided to jump at the chance tonight. Chapter 509, Dealing with Her, 2. Chu Lian really didn't know if she should cry or laugh. She showed her pale and smooth hand to Changdi. Changdi pretended not to understand his wife's meaning. Where's the letter? I want to read it. I want to see what nonsense that Xiao Bojian was trying to pull. Chu Lian was about to explode in anger. What kind of situation was this? Why did it feel like she had been wronged through no fault of her own? Her hand was beginning to feel sore from being outstretched, but He Changdi didn't move an inch. I want to see the letter. Chu Lian reminded him again. He Changdi awkwardly coughed a few times. He tried to avoid meeting his wife's questioning gaze. Chu Lian gaped in shock. She asked with a hint of disbelief, "Don't tell me you destroyed the letter." He Sanlang awkwardly turned his head away. He pursed his lips without speaking. Chu Lian noticed his evasive gaze and knew that she had hit the nail on the head. Anger flared up within her, giving her the urge to punch him a few times. She puffed up her cheeks and glared at He Changdi with her big eyes for a long moment. Finally, Chu Lian angrily turned around so her back faced He Changdi. It was only at this moment that He Changdi finally realized that he had been too impulsive earlier. However, there was absolutely no way he could have controlled the rage and jealousy in his heart while holding a letter from his love rival in his hand. He Changdi knew he had made a mistake. He reached out, wanting to turn Chu Lian around to face him. Chu Lian wasn't willing to let him have his way and stubbornly ignored him. He Sanlang knew his wife was really angry with him, so he didn't dare to use force. He could only pat on her back lightly, like he was trying to soothe a grumpy little kitten. Chu Lian didn't want to continue like this for long, so she spoke up, "Go wash up first." He Changdi stared at the side profile of his wife's face for a while before he got up and went to the bathroom. Chu Lian's mood was slightly better when she didn't hear him call for the maidservants outside. She laid on her side, wrapped inside the soft blankets, and thought about the things that He Changdi had just told her. She was really curious about what Xiao Bojian had written in the letter that Fuyan had been keeping. Also, how had Fuyan gotten hold of that letter? It was too bad that He Changdi had already burned that letter. She couldn't even read it if she wanted to. Perhaps due to having waited for He Changdi too late into the night, or perhaps from all the tiring activities of the day, she ended up falling asleep as she was thinking. When He Sanlang came out of the bathroom, the first thing he noticed was his wife's sweet sleeping visage. He didn't get into bed immediately. He sat by the bedside for a long time, dressed only in a thin sleeping gown. His shadowed eyes stayed on Chu Lian's gentle face. It was as if he wanted to engrave her face into his heart, so that he would never forget it. The night had already passed when he finally laid down and embraced the petite woman beside him. Slivers of light were creeping up over the horizon to the east. The next morning, when the young couple ate breakfast together, the atmosphere between them had become a lot more relaxed. It was such a surprise that senior servant Gue even purposely asked Wenlon about it in private. When Chu Lian and He Changdi finished their breakfast and the maidservants had cleared the table, He Changdi asked Chu Lian a question as she was sipping some honey water. "How are you planning to deal with Fuyan?" Now that they had lured all the perpetrators out from hiding, the couple didn't need to continue acting at odds anymore, so their interactions were naturally more intimate than yesterday. However, the tension from their quarrel in the carriage still hadn't been dispelled completely. Thus, there was still a tiny bit of distance between them. Chu Lian understood her own shortcomings. She wasn't someone born and raised during the Great Wu dynasty after all, so she was too soft-hearted at times. You decide what to do with her. He Changdi looked up to meet her eyes. Aren't you afraid that it'll be too severe with her? Despite everything, she has been serving you since your maiden days. Chu Lian shook her head. Since I've already handed her over to you, do with her as you see fit. If you leave it to me, it might cause us some trouble in the future. He Sanlang dropped the topic. All right. Since you've handed her over to me, don't ask about it anymore. Chu Lian and He Changdi were still talking when a maidservant came in to report that matriarch he had requested the couple to go over. The couple exchanged looks. They returned to their room to change before going to Qingxi Hall. It was still rather early. It wasn't even time yet for the usual morning greetings. Most of the family were already present when the young couple arrived at Qingxi Hall. Even Countess Jingan was only a few moments behind them. The couple from the main branch was also present. Madame Zhou had a terrible expression on her face. Matriarchy's eyes turned towards Chu Lian and He Changdi right after they came in. She calmly said, "Take a seat. I've called everyone here to conclude last night's incident." The matriarch didn't say anything else. She looked like she was waiting for someone. Chu Lian quickly found out who she was waiting for. A few minutes later, Great Dr. Miao strode in, carrying his medicine box. After staying up for the whole night, Great Dr. Miao's complexion wasn't very good. However, he seemed to be in a rather relaxed mood. Based on his expression, Chu Lian could guess that Miaojin and her child were already fine. As expected, Great Dr. Miao cupped his hands together in a greeting when he entered the parlor. He stroked his white beard as he said, "Miss Miaojin is fine now. If she takes in proper nourishment and takes care of her health in the coming days, she will be able to give birth to her child without any problems." Matriarch He and Countess Jingan's faces were naturally filled with joy after hearing his report. This was all thanks to Great Dr. Miao. Matriarch He bowed to express her humble gratitude. However, Great Dr. Miao's expression remained rather blasé. There wasn't any fear on his face as he remarked, "This old man thinks that the matriarch is thanking the wrong person. The one you should thank is third young madam." Chapter 510, Chu Lian's Defense. 1. Once Dr. Miao's words rang out, Matriarchy's first reaction was stunned silence before her expression instantly darkened. Chu Lian was also shocked by the doctor's action. She helplessly shook her head. Great Dr. Miao was too accustomed to acting as he liked. Although he had spoken up to defend her, it had backfired instead. Judging by the expression on the matriarch's face, it seemed that the misunderstanding between them had deepened. Great Dr. Miao only realized that he should have put more thought into his words after the fact. However, there was no use in regretting it now. Words couldn't be taken back once thrown out. He made a cupped fist salute towards Matriarch He before finding an empty seat in the corners of the parlor and sitting down. Matriarch He wasn't in the mood to be angry with Great Dr. Miao right now. Her expression turned grim and she abruptly turned her gaze towards Chu Lian, who was seated beside He Changdi. She demanded with a thunderous shout, "Madam Chu, do you still have anything to say for yourself?" It was out of Chu Lian's expectations that the matriarch's first reaction was to condemn her, let alone with such a hostile tone. This was likely all thanks to Great Dr. Miao's previous remark. Likewise, He Changdi hadn't expected that grandmother's mindset hadn't changed even after a whole night. It wasn't as if this incident was airtight. If Matriarch He had her wits about her, then she would have already realized the truth overnight. He Sanlang's expression darkened. He was about to stand up to defend Chu Lian, but Chu Lian tugged at his hand and lightly shook her head. After that, she stood up in a calm and easy manner. There was a faint smile on her face, as if she wasn't facing a trial and interrogation from all sides. Instead, her peaceful expression made it seem like she was enjoying a lakeside garden with beautiful scenery. She looked around leisurely. Her gaze stayed the longest on Madame Zhou and eldest Madame's faces, before she finally made eye contact with the matriarch's muddled yet sharp eyes. There wasn't a single trace of fear in Chu Lian's bright eyes. A moment later, her reply to the matriarch resounded in the parlor for everyone to hear. In reply to grandmother, granddaughter-in-law has plenty to say. Matriarch He's expression became even darker and uglier. Beside her, He Ying's temper was also provoked by Chu Lian's nonchalant attitude. She sneered coldly, "Sanlang's wife, do you think that everyone will believe you just because you're acting this way? Let me warn you. Even if the child is safe, we won't pretend like this never happened. Mother, our estate can't tolerate the existence of such a cruel and vile woman. He Ying's words were very harsh. She had obviously said those words because she wanted to kick Chu Lian out of House Jinggan and to have He Changdi divorce her. What a pity that she didn't have much in the way of smarts. The Empress Dowager herself had decreed He Changdi and Chu Lian's marriage. He Changdi wouldn't be allowed to divorce his wife as he liked. Furthermore, Chu Lian had a noble title on her that gave her the status of an imperial daughter. Aunt, please make sure to your brain before speaking in the future. Polish your eyes while you're at it too. When dealing with people like eldest madam, there was no need to reason with her and give her respect. Although matriarchy knew that He Ying's words had been out of line, since He Ying was her very own daughter, she still sided with He Ying in the end. She reprimanded, Madam Chu, Miaozhen nearly had a miscarriage because she ate the candied hawthorns that you made. Though that child will be born an illegitimate child, but he's still your eldest brother-in-law's first son. The first person to feel guilt from the matriarch's words was Countess Jinggan. She couldn't resist glancing at her youngest daughter-in-law, who was standing ramrod straight. Mother, I'm also at fault regarding this matter. I'm the one who told Sanlang's wife that I wanted to eat some candied hawthorns to boost my appetite. It didn't occur to me that the pregnant Miaozhen liked sour foods. Don't say any more. Even if that's true, she was still the one who made those harmful candied hawthorns. Anyone who had a mind would probably have realized what was going on by now. Matriarchy hadn't convened this trial just to investigate the truth regarding Miaozhen's miscarriage. Her hidden motive was to take this opportunity to discipline Chu Lian. He Changdi clenched his fists as a glint flashed in his deep eyes. The matriarch had been wielding great power and influence within House Jinggan for many years after all. Moreover, Countess Jinggan had been bedridden for so long that she hadn't managed the household for a long time. Thus, her character was much weaker in comparison. After that retort from her mother-in-law, she couldn't continue speaking. Chu Lian didn't seem to care about matriarchy's harsh words. She calmly took a couple steps forward, tilted her head, and said, Grandmother, even if you've already decided that I'm guilty, you should let me have a chance to defend myself at the very least. Matriarchy stared at Chu Lian without saying a word. Her silence meant that she had agreed to give Chu Lian a chance to explain herself. He Ying smirked. Her eyes were full of pride for herself. She wanted to see what kind of explanation her nephew's wife could come up with today. Chu Lian wasn't stupid. She wasn't really going to let others slander her. She turned her head towards Countess Jinggan. Mother, do you still have some of the candied hawthorns that I sent you? Countess Jinggan quickly nodded in response. There is. Miaozhen only ate a few because she wanted a snack. The rest are still here. After she said that, Countess Jinggan turned around and told her handmaid to retrieve the hawthorns. Chapter 511, Chu Lian's Defense. 2. Countess Jinggan's courtyard wasn't far from Qingxi Hall and the maidservant was fast on her feet. Several minutes later, the plate of candied hawthorns that Chu Lian had personally made was placed on the sandalwood table in the center of the parlor. Chu Lian walked over to the table and pointed at the tasty-looking candied hawthorns on the white porcelain plate. What do all of you think this is? Chu Lian asked. He Changdi was keeping a close watch on Chu Lian. After hearing her question, an idea popped up in his mind. Eldest madam covered her mouth and tittered loudly. Sanlang's wife, you're not trying to stall time, right? We're not blind. Do you think we can't recognize hawthorns? Countess Jinggan seemed rather puzzled as well. Sanlang's wife, these are the candied hawthorns that you sent over. I've tried them myself. The sweet and sour taste was really appetizing. Chu Lian's lips lifted up into a smile and she called over one of the maidservants in the parlor. The maidservant trembled with fear. She kept her head lowered as she asked in a shaky voice, Third young madam, what do you require of this servant? Chu Lien held up a sugar-coated hawthorn and handed it to the maidservant. Why don't you try one, and then tell me what this is? The maidservant was clearly relieved to hear that it was such a simple request. She timidly took the hawthorn ball from Chu Lien's pale and delicate fingertips and slowly placed it in her mouth. The sweet and sour taste spread on her tongue. It was neither too sweet nor too greasy. After eating one, there was an irresistible urge to have another. After carefully chewing and swallowing it, the maidservant couldn't resist smacking her lips a couple of times as if she was trying to bring back the taste of the hawthorn ball she just ate. Replying to third young madam, it's hawthorn. It tasted really good. It's the first time this servant has eaten such a delicious hawthorn. The hawthorns that she ate were usually very sour. She had never thought that it could be so tasty when it was prepared in this way. The gluttonous maidservant couldn't help glancing at the plate of candied hawthorns a couple more times. Ying rolled her eyes, but Chu Lien let out a smile. She waved her hand to dismiss the maidservant. She then took another hawthorn ball and walked towards Great Dr. Miao. Great Dr. Miao smiled. Honored lady, you wouldn't be asking this old man to taste one as well, right? Chu Lien stared at him with an expression that read, you should know what to do. Great Dr. Miao found it funny and shook his head with a grin. He took the hawthorn ball and sniffed it first. After that, he broke it apart and carefully examined the ingredients inside. Finally, he burst out laughing. He stood up, holding half a hawthorn in each hand, and strode towards Matriarchy. He lifted his hand respectfully. Matriarchy, this isn't hawthorn. It's a special type of gooseberry from the northern border. Its taste is very similar to a hawthorn, but its effect is completely different. Hawthorns are good for digestion and circulation, but pregnant women shouldn't eat too much of it. The gooseberries from the northern border possess a warmer attribute. It can nourish vitality and calm the mind. It can even be used as an ingredient for medicines to stabilize pregnancies. For pregnant women, there's no harm at all in eating this. It's even beneficial to their pregnancy. When compared like this, the medical properties of the northern gooseberries that Chu Lien used were quite close to those of wild ginseng. Great Dr. Miao's words shocked nearly everyone in the parlor. What? Those confections on the table weren't hawthorns, and they were some kind of gooseberry from the northern border instead? How could that be? If that really wasn't a plate of hawthorns, then this incident had nothing to do with Chu Lien at all. There was one person whose expression couldn't be described with just the word shocked. Madame Zhou's face had instantly turned deathly pale and she clenched her hands tightly under her wide sleeves. She didn't even notice when her sharp nails had pierced the skin of her palms. A strange look appeared in He Changde's eyes after Great Dr. Miao revealed the truth. Matriarch He Ying, and even Miss Pan were unconvinced. What are you talking about? This is clearly hawthorn. Matriarch He was still doubtful. Great Dr. Miao scoffed. If the matriarch doesn't believe this old man's words, then you can go ask the imperial physicians from the palace to distinguish them. Most of the people in the parlor were convinced after Great Dr. Miao said that. Chu Lien bobbed towards Matriarch He and Countess Jingan. Grandmother, mother, I'm done speaking. Countess Jingan's face was full of guilt. Lianer, mother has wronged you. On the other hand, Matriarch He didn't apologize. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes, as if she was calming her fluctuating emotions. She opened her eyes a long while later. Her gaze swept over everyone in the parlor before she let out a small sigh. Since this matter has nothing to do with Sanlang's wife, then Sanlang's wife can go sit to one side. It was only then that Chu Lien turned around and returned to her seat beside He Changde. When Yi Sanlang caught sight of the tranquil and serene look in Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes, his heart felt painfully sour. So the reason she had refused to let him intervene earlier was because she had already taken precautions beforehand. If it wasn't for her lack of trust in grandmother and mother, why would Chu Lian have prepared a backup plan for everything? Did that also mean that she had some backup plans for him? The storm brewing in Yi Sanlang's expression worsened when he thought about this possibility. He Changdi and Chu Lian were too occupied with their own thoughts to listen to what matriarch he had to say until a loud smack jolted them back to reality. They watched as the table in front of the matriarch trembled from the force of the old lattice blow, followed by an angry bellow from the matriarch. This old woman wants this matter investigated thoroughly. Even if this estate is turned upside down, this old lady wants to know who the culprit behind this terrible incident is. The matriarch was really furious now. Anyone with a few brain cells could tell that Chu Lian had been framed by someone. There weren't many family members in House Jingan to begin with, so matriarch he was extremely sensitive about anything that endangered the children of their house and their bloodline. In House Jingan, little schemes against one another could be tolerated. Even coveting the family's wealth could be forgiven. However, plotting to harm their bloodline was absolutely forbidden. Chapter 512, Mutual Divorce. 1. Yi Sanlang stood up at this time. Grandmother, leave it to me to investigate this matter. Matriarch he looked at her most accomplished and youngest grandson first, before glancing at the frowning Yi Changqi. She brooded over it for a moment before speaking. This concerns the bloodline of our He family, so we'll let the two of you handle it. The brothers agreed in unison. Thus, the morning interrogation was concluded. Matriarch he ordered everyone to return to their respective courtyards. Off in the side room next to the parlor of Qingxi Hall, Muxiang was listening to a maidservant's report. There was a stormy expression on her pretty face. After the maidservant left, she took up the teapot on the small table beside her and smashed it on the ground. The freshly brewed hot tea scattered all over the patterned carpet, soaking a large portion of it. Her hands tightened into fists, reflecting the fury in her heart. She never would have thought that her meticulously planned trap would be solved so easily by Chu Lian. Who exactly was that woman occupying her original body? Madame Zhou returned to her own courtyard in a state of confusion and panic. Senior servant Xiao had a cup of tea ready for her master, but Madame Zhou pushed it away. Senior servant Xiao had no choice but to put the sencha aside. She attempted to comfort Madame Zhou. Eldest young madam, you must not panic at this time. Please don't worry. The investigation hasn't come upon any leads that would point to us, and I've already taken care of that maidservant. Even if eldest young master and third young master suspect you, as long as you deny it, what can they do to you since they won't be able to find any evidence? The panic that had flooded Madame Zhou's mind completely dissipated when she heard Senior Servant Xiao's words. She grabbed onto Senior Servant Xiao's arm. Her voice became much calmer. Yes, Momo, you're right. Even if they start investigating us, they won't be able to do anything as long as we deny it. Senior Servant Xiao nodded. That's right. Eldest young madam, we can't panic and make a mistake at such a crucial time. Right after they had finished talking, there was a burst of commotion from the outer room. Madame Zhou twitched as her body tensed up from a sudden rush of fear. She turned her head and looked at Senior Servant Xiao. Senior Servant Xiao frowned and patted Madame Zhou's hand to placate her. Eldest young madam, please take a rest first. This old servant will go out to see what happened. Those brats are becoming more and more undisciplined. Madame Zhou nodded her head wearily and leaned back on the soft lounge to rest. Senior Servant Xiao lifted the curtains, only to see Jin Shui kneeling in the middle of the room. It was apparent that Jin Shui had already been punished. There were bloodstains on both her hands and arms, and she was crying as she laid sprawled on the floor. Senior Servant Xiao's heart thumped in alarm. In a stiff motion, she raised her head to look towards the seats at the head of the room, where she was greeted with the sight of Echanchi and Echangdi. They were both looking down at her with ice-cold eyes. The two brothers who looked nothing alike carried the same icy glint within their eyes at this moment. Senior servant Xiao, bring eldest young madam out here. Despite the pleasant and husky tones of Echangdi's voice, his words sounded like a death knell. Senior servant Xiao's entire body turned to jelly. If she hadn't been leaning against the doorframe, she would have hit the floor. Despite her experience with these sorts of situations, she wasn't able to remain calm when it came to facing these two brothers. The voice she let out was shaky. Eldest young master, third young master, eldest young madam, she just settled down to rest. If you need anything, just let this old servant know. She still dares to rest. The temper of the normally calm Echangchi was out in full force now. Although he had been disappointed with his wife, he had thought to make the best of it and just continue living in this way. However, Madame Zhou had actually done something so despicable. She had plotted to kill his child and placed the blame on her sister-in-law. What a clever lady in charge. Senior servant Xiao could tell with one glance that the current situation was really bad. She glared fiercely at Jin Shui, who was still prone on the ground. With a loud roar, she jumped on the hapless handmaid and started beating her up. You little bitch. What did you say to eldest young master and third young master? You caused a misunderstanding between them and eldest young madam. You're a bitch who betrayed your own master. I'm going to beat you to death today. Senior servant Xiao instantly turned into a madwoman. She held Jin Shui up and started to pummel her brutally. Her actions were so sudden that even Echangdi and Echangchi didn't manage to stop her in time. Jin Shui had already received punishment from the brothers and was lying on the ground half dead. She didn't have any strength to resist senior servant Xiao, so she received several heavy blows full on. Luckily, Laiwa swiftly ordered the guards beside him to separate them. If not, senior servant Xiao would really have beaten Jin Shui to death. Jin Shui coughed several times in pain. When she finally recovered a little, she sent a wrathful glare at senior servant Xiao. You're trying to kill me to get rid of all the witnesses. I'm not going to let you have your way. I'm telling you now, even if I die, I'm going to drag both of you down with me. Senior servant Xiao's expression changed. She knew that their plan had failed because she hadn't succeeded in silencing Jin Shui. Her hair was in a mess because of the fight just now. Several strands had fallen out of her bun and now covered half of her face. Under the cover of her hair, various emotions flashed over her face. In the end, she gritted her teeth as if she had finally made a decision. She turned around and hugged Echangdi's leg, wailing loudly, "Eldest young master, this old servant was responsible for everything. It has nothing to do with eldest young madam. This old servant came up with the idea while blinded by greed. It was also this old servant who schemed against third young madam. You and eldest young madam have been married for so many years, so you should understand her personality. Although she's competitive, she's not calculating in the slightest. She wouldn't dare conspire to harm the bloodline." Senior servant Xiao was choking on her sobs. It's this servant who couldn't stand it anymore. This servant planned everything because this servant doesn't want eldest young madam to continue suffering injustice. This old servant is eldest young madam's nursemaid. Eldest young madam didn't say anything because she wanted to protect this servant. Eldest young master, please consider the many years of affection as husband and wife between you and eldest young madam, as well as little N and little Lin, and spare eldest young madam this time. Chapter 513, Mutual Divorce. 2. Senior servant Xiao had taken all the blame onto herself through her confession and she had painted a very pitiful picture. However, Echangdi and Echangchi remained unmoved. If this had happened in the past before the relationship between Dalong and his wife had become strained, then perhaps senior servant Xiao would have gotten some understanding and sympathy from He Changqi. However, after experiencing major disappointment from the last incident, he no longer believed in Madame Zhou. If Madame Zhou could treat their very own daughters that way, then there was no limit to what she wouldn't do. It was even less likely for He Changdi to believe in senior servant Xiao's words. The one who had been framed earlier was his wife. If they could take pity on Madame Zhou right now, then why hadn't anyone taken pity on his wife earlier? There was still a pool of rage seething in his belly that he hadn't been able to vent. Senior servant Xiao and the others were standing in the line of a volcano. He Changqi kicked senior servant Xiao away. He had a strong and burly figure, tan skin and a square jaw, so he looked even more frightening when he kept a grim expression on his face. Tell that Madame Zhou to come out. Don't make me go in myself to get her. He Changqi's voice was piercingly cold. Senior servant Xiao understood that there was absolutely no way to save this situation now. She laid prone on the floor for a long while before stumbling into the inner room. 2 hours later, in the study of the main branch's courtyard, the brothers, He Changdi and He Changqi, sat across from each other. They each had extremely terrible expressions on their face. He Changdi turned to look at his eldest brother, who was resting his eyes. Eldest brother, what are you planning to do? He Changqi's eyes slowly slid open. He let out a mocking bark of laughter. I thought that we would be able to spend a lifetime together. I never thought that we would end up like this. Third brother, I've already decided. We're getting a divorce. It's better for everyone involved. The current dynasty was more open-minded, so while there weren't many divorced couples, they did exist. Moreover, there were many who remarried after a divorce. In actual fact, for cases like He Changqi's, the husband could choose to forcefully divorce his wife. However, he didn't want to do that. A mutual divorce and a one-sided divorce initiated by the husband had two completely different outcomes. After a mutual divorce, the woman could remarry. However, a woman forcefully divorced by her husband would essentially become a social pariah. There were only two choices for wives who were kicked out from noble houses: become a nun or commit suicide. In the end, He Changqi had still thought of their many years together as spouses and he had given her some leeway. Actually, the main reason He Changqi wanted to divorce Madame Zhou was due to her abuse of their children. They didn't have a son, but He Changqi had never insisted on having one. He had simply thought that he would wait until a suitable age to take a concubine, and if the concubine gave birth to any sons, he would have registered the son under Madame Zhou's name and let her raise him as her own. They could just think of him as their own child. However, if Madame Zhou disagreed with that, then he could have considered adopting a son from second brother or third brother's families. Anyway, there were so many solutions they could have considered. Unfortunately, Madame Zhou had chosen the most extreme one. He could have let it go if it was only their relationship which had suffered from her actions, but Madame Zhou had turned her grudge against him towards their two young daughters instead. She constantly blamed their daughters for not being boys on a daily basis. He Changqi had only found this out after noticing that something was off with his daughters and making secret inquiries into the cause. How could he let his children be raised under a mother like this? It would be better to get a divorce sooner. He Changdi hadn't expected his eldest brother to have thought it through so quickly. He nodded. Since you've already made your decision, then I don't need to say anything else, eldest brother. You should inform the Zhou family as soon as possible. He Changqi sighed and stared at the desk in a daze. He Sanlang stood up. Eldest brother, make sure you have a good rest. I'm going back first. He Changqi waved at his brother. He Changdi stood at the entrance of the study and turned back to observe his eldest brother. He Changqi's back was against the light. From this angle, the messy stubble covering his chin and the exhaustion on his pale face made him look 10 years older. It was clear that his eldest brother had aged after this whole incident. He pursed his lips, opened the door, and strode out. Sunlight shone down on Changdi's body. It should have been warm and cozy, but he couldn't feel any traces of warmth. His gaze was icy as he looked at the closed wooden door of the study. He knew that there was someone else directing this incident from behind the scenes. Madame Zhou was only a chess piece in the hands of that mastermind. He will definitely find that hidden culprit. Changdi lifted his head and looked towards the bright sunshine in the sky. When the sunlight pierced his eyes, he lowered his head and turned towards the direction of Songtao Court. The grim line of his lips suddenly lifted. His sunshine was right over there. The only place he could feel genuine warmth was right beside Chu Lian. He immediately cast away all the aimless thoughts in his mind and quickly made his way towards Songtao Court. In the imperial palace, Qingjing Hall, Eunuch Wei was in the midst of serving tea to the emperor. Your Majesty, you've already been reading the imperial memorials for 2 hours. It might be good to take a break. The Qingping emperor set down the document in his hand in exchange for the cup of freshly brewed tea. After taking a sip, he set down the teacup and abruptly asked, "Is it time to let He Yanwen return?" He Yanwen, the Defender General of the South, also known as Count Jingon. TL note, there are 2 specific terms for divorce used in ancient China, which are a little hard to translate into an exact term in English. Firstly, there's a mutual divorce, where husband and wife agree to separate. The wife is looked upon more favorably by society in this option. Secondly, there's a forced divorce or one-sided divorce, which is only ever initiated by the husband and is specified in the Chinese term itself, retiring wife. The forced divorce is only used in extreme cases where the wife breaks major family rules, but may also be used to shame/get rid of legal wives to marry a concubine, as you might have seen in some dramas. This is also why women divorced in this manner are essentially social outcasts. As for the imperial memorials the emperor is looking at, they're like long reports from his subjects, usually his ministers, about various matters in his kingdom. You can read more about it on Wikipedia, https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/memorial_to_the_throne. Chapter 514, Finances. 1. Eunuch Wei didn't dare to reply. After serving the Qingping emperor for so many years, he understood that the emperor wasn't actually trying to ask him for advice. The emperor had likely already come to a decision in his mind. The question was entirely rhetorical. As expected, after a few minutes, the emperor ordered, "Call Yang Yanfeng in." "Yes, Your Majesty, this servant will go immediately." After the whole fiasco with Miaojin, everyone, including Dalong, Matriarch He and Countess Jingon, were in agreement with the main branch's divorce. On the next day, House Jingon sent a notice to House Dingyuan. They had already prepared the divorce papers with the relevant authorities the day before. The only step remaining was for Madame Zhou to pack up her dowry and leave the estate. Madame Zhou was the eldest daughter of the second branch of House Dingyuan. While she was a true noble lady, old Marquis Dingyuan was already getting on in age and the main branch of House Dingyuan was in charge now. Once old Marquis Dingyuan passed on and the main branch succeeded the title of Marquis, the second branch would be cast out of the estate. The second branch's influence would only deteriorate from then on. Changdi was now trusted by the emperor and he held the title of Marquis. The second branch of House Dingyuan could no longer match up to House Jingon. Even though Madame Zhou had been divorced, the second branch of House Dingyuan didn't dare to make any comments. Furthermore, this had all been Madame Zhou's own doing. As much as Madame Zhou's mother wanted to reprimand her daughter, since she had already gotten divorced by her husband, there was nothing else to say. Since she couldn't do anything to her daughter, Madame Zhou's mother, the second Madame of House Dingyuan, could only help her daughter pack up her dowry. Luckily her daughter hadn't been a complete idiot. After so many years, her dowry hadn't decreased one bit. Conversely, it had actually grown much larger. Madame Zhou had been in charge of the household for so many years. Of course she had dipped her hands into the public funds from time to time. Once Madame Zhou's dowry had been taken out from the storehouses, the amount of silver as well as the properties belonging to the estate had actually been halved. Madame Zhou took her divorce papers and returned home to the Dingyuan estate with second Madame richer than before. While this was what the He family had agreed on, there wasn't any hint of a smile on Matriarchy's face. In the warm room of Qingxi Hall, Matriarchy sat on the hearthbed. Although it was already early spring, the winter chill still hung in the air in the capital. Matriarchy's body was weak to start with, so she couldn't bear to be out in the cold. The fires warming the hearthbed and the walls had never stopped. Ying and her daughter, Pan Yanjun, were keeping the matriarch company in that room as warm as spring. Pan Yanjun was squatting by the matriarch's side and kneading her legs while Ying was flipping through some account books on the other. The matriarch's eyes were slightly shut. She breathed a sigh of comfort before opening her eyes again. "You're getting better at this, Miss Shen. My old bones are feeling more comfortable thanks to your massage." Pan Yanjun blinked her eyes bashfully and smiled. "Grandmother, as long as it's good for your health, I won't mind serving you like this forever." The matriarch reached out to stroke Pan Nianzhen's smooth locks. "Grandmother can't bear to tire you out so. All right, your hands must be sore from massaging me for so long. Go and take a rest at the side. There are some new confections on that table that the kitchen sent over this morning. Why don't you have a taste and see if you like them?" "It's okay, I'll massage grandmother for a while longer." Pan Nianzhen's actions and words had completely won over Matriarchy's heart. Ying secretly sent a look at her daughter, indicating that she had done well. A wave of gratitude washed over Matriarchy's heart. Only her real daughter and granddaughter would treat her so well. They weren't at all like those granddaughters-in-law she had. Although they had married into this house, they had grown up in other houses after all. This old woman regrets not bringing the two of you back to the capital earlier. Otherwise, Miss Shen's marriage wouldn't be delayed. Pan Yanjun was the same age as Chu Lian and she had turned 16 over the new year. Since she hadn't been engaged yet, it was indeed a little late for her. Ying smiled. "Mother, you don't have to blame yourself. We're fine as long as we know that we're in your heart." The matriarch feigned an angry glare at her. "You silly girl. What are you saying? You should know better at your age. I gave birth to you myself, why would I not have you in my heart?" This time, when Ying smiled again, a satisfied glint flashed across her eyes as she lowered her head. In a short moment, Ying handed the account book over to Matriarchy with a frown. "Mother, take a look at these accounts." Matriarchy's health was failing and she didn't have as much vigor as before. Although the household management rights were in her hands, she hadn't been able to work on the household at all. Most of the work had been given to her handmaid, Mu Xiang, while another portion had been handed over to senior servant Liu. Ying was now the one looking over most of the accounts. Her eyesight had become blurry over the past 2 years, so she couldn't quite see the fine words on the accounts now. "What's wrong?" Matriarchy took the book and squinted hard. It took her some effort before she could finally see the words clearly. Once she read the writing on the book, her eyes widened in shock. "That Madame Zhou. I shouldn't have left her in charge of the household back then. Half of the money and properties of the estate had actually been taken away. That was a whole half of the assets under the Jingan estate." You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.